Hey friend, welcome back to Soft Mystic Stories. If you are here right now, settling in, pulling the blanket a little closer, maybe resting your phone on the pillow, I want you to know something. You picked the perfect night for this, because tonight, we are not going anywhere loud or fast. Tonight I am going to take you somewhere candle-lit, somewhere marble-floored and velvet-draped, somewhere that smells faintly of rosewater and old secrets. And I want to ask you something before we begin. Think about the most powerful room you've ever walked into. Maybe it was a boardroom, maybe a courtroom, maybe just your boss's office on a bad Monday. Now imagine the real decisions in that room were never made at the table. They are made in a quiet corner between two people who everyone else had already looked past. That is exactly where we're going tonight. Now, if this kind of storytelling is your thing, the slow, the deep, the kind that actually makes your mind wander in the best possible way, I would genuinely love it if you hit that subscribe button and tapped a like on this video. Not because I am asking out of habit, but because every single person who does that helps me keep making nights like this one possible. And hey, drop a comment down below telling me where you're watching from right now. Are you in bed on the couch? Maybe somewhere a little more adventurous. I am always genuinely curious. Alright, dim the lights if you have not already. Maybe turn on a soft fan, or let the night air do its thing, and let us begin. Close your eyes for just a moment, and picture this. Queen sits at the center of her court, gowned, jeweled, untouchable. Every eye in the room is on her. Every tongue speaks of her power. Every portrait painted for 500 years will show her face, and her face alone. Just off to the side, always off to the side, stand the women you almost never notice. They are arranging her sleeve. They're handing her a folded piece of paper. They are leaning in, whispering something so quietly the room cannot hear. And here is what took me completely by surprise when I started digging into this history. Those women, the ones nobody was looking at, they were often the most dangerous people in the room. Welcome, friends, to the world of royal ladies-in-waiting. And I promise you, by the time this story is done, you will never look at a supporting role the same way again. Let us start at the very beginning, because most people hear the phrase, lady-in-waiting, and picture something like a fancy personal assistant, someone who carries the Queen's handbag, someone who smiles politely at banquets, someone who exists essentially as elegant wallpaper. That picture is almost entirely wrong. The truth is so much stranger, so much richer, and honestly, so much more ruthless. A lady-in-waiting in her truest historical form was a noblewoman appointed to serve in the personal household of a queen, a princess, or another high-ranking woman of the royal family. She was not a servant in the ordinary sense. She was nobility herself, often from one of the most powerful families in the country, and her presence in the queen's chambers was not an act of charity or decoration. It was a calculated political move, performed on both sides of the arrangement. Think about what it actually meant to be physically close to a queen. Not just in the same palace, but in the same room, in the same private chamber, sometimes in the same bed. That proximity was not just intimate, it was power. Raw, quiet, enormously consequential power. And the history of ladies-in-waiting is at its heart the history of what people do when they understand that completely. Now let me give you a sense of how far back this actually goes, because we are not talking about some small Victorian custom. The origins of the lady-in-waiting trace all the way to the 9th century, when Carolingian queens first began building formal households of their own. A scholar named Hintzmar, writing in the year 882, described the royal household of Charles the Coat, and noted something remarkable for its time, that court officials took orders from the queen, as well as the king. The queen had her own structure, her own staff, her own web, but the role was still small and quiet for hundreds of years. In the year 1286, the Queen of France had precisely 5 ladies-in-waiting on her official roster. 5. And then something shifted. The Renaissance happened. And with it, everything about court life exploded into ceremony, theater, and ambition. The courts of Italy, Florence, Venice, Milan became laboratories of a new kind of power, one that was performed as much as it was exercised. Women were suddenly not just present in court life. They were central to it. They were the living proof of a ruler's refinement, his taste, his civilization. From Italy, this new court culture spread north to the Duce of Burgundy, widely considered the most elaborate court in all of Europe in the 15th century. And from Burgundy, it moved to France. And from France, it swept across every royal palace on the continent. By the 16th century, the French court alone had expanded its ladies-in-waiting from 5 to 54. 54 noble women, organized into a strict hierarchy, with different titles, different duties, and very different levels of access to the queen. That number matters because 54 women, all from powerful families, all positioned inside the most intimate spaces of royal life. That is not a household staff. That is a network. That is an intelligent system. That is a web of obligation, alliance, debt, and loyalty that stretched into nearly every corner of the kingdom. And here is something I think is genuinely fascinating and a little bit uncomfortable. Most ladies-in-waiting received no official salary. None. They were not there for the paycheck. The position was understood as an exchange of a completely different kind. You gave the queen your time, your discretion, your presence. And in return, you gained something worth far more than money in that world. You gained access. A lady-in-waiting had direct access to the queen, who wielded varying degrees of influence over the king and his court. This allowed ladies-in-waiting to advance the petitions and career interests of their families and others. Let that sink in for a moment. If your brother needed a military commission, a word from the right lady at the right moment in the queen's private chambers could make that happen. If your father's land dispute needed royal attention, a gentle mention timed perfectly between the queen's morning prayer and her afternoon correspondence could shift an outcome that no lawyer could touch. The ladies-in-waiting were not serving power. They were swimming in it, and the best ones were extraordinary swimmers. Now, who actually got these positions? Because it was not simply a matter of showing up and being pretty and well-dressed. Though being well-dressed was, as we'll see later, a surprisingly serious business. In medieval England, kinship ties were a primary criterion, as queens favored relatives, or allies whose familial bonds provided verifiable discretion and alignment with royal interests. In plain language, queens wanted women they could trust. And in a world where trust was rare and betrayal was common, women I can trust usually meant women whose families have too much to lose if they betray me. That is not cynical. That is just how power worked. Beyond family connections, a young woman hoping to become a lady-in-waiting needed to be educated. Not in the modern academic sense, but in the court sense, which was in some ways more demanding. Preparation to become a lady-in-waiting included gaining proficiency in several languages. She needed to sing or play a musical instrument. She needed to dance with grace. She needed to know when to speak, and more importantly, when to be perfectly, deliberately, magnificently silent. And she needed to be able to read a room, not just for mood, but for danger, because the court was, for all its silk and candlelight, a genuinely dangerous place, and a lady-in-waiting, who could not feel the air change before a storm, who could not sense when a royal mood was shifting, when a political wind was turning. That woman was a liability, not an asset. The ones who survived longest were the ones who understood something most people spend their whole lives failing to grasp. Watching carefully is a form of power. Knowing when to stay quiet is a form of power. Being the person everyone overlooks is a form of power. Now I want to introduce you to someone. Her name is Anne Boleyn, and her story is in many ways the perfect illustration of everything. I've been describing both the brilliance of what a lady-in-waiting could achieve and the terrifying fragility of it. Anne was born around the year 141, into a family with considerable ambition, but only moderate standing. Her father, Thomas Blind, was a capable diplomat, skilled enough to arrange for his daughter to be sent to the French court at the age of 12, to serve as a lady-in-waiting to the French Queen Mary Tudor. There, Anne absorbed something, not just French manners, and not just the language, though she became extraordinarily fluent. She absorbed a way of being in a court, a way of holding attention without demanding it, a way of making a room aware of you without announcing yourself. She returned to England, polished, mysterious and magnetic, and she took up a position, you already know where this is going, as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England, wife of King Henry VIII, and in that role, serving the Queen whose position she would eventually take. Anne Boleyn watched. She waited. She understood her axis, her angle, her proximity to the most powerful man in England, and she played it with extraordinary precision. Now, I want to be clear. The story of Anne Boleyn is not a simple one, and we are going to explore it in much more depth later in this series. But what I want you to hold on to right now is this. Her first school was not a palace. Her first school was the Queen's chambers, and her curriculum was observation. The hierarchy inside those chambers was, by the way, much more structured than most people realize. Ladies-in-waiting performed intimate duties, such as putting on and removing the Queen's clothing and bathing her. They were expected to put her needs above those of their own husbands and children. They spent most of the day with the Queen and provided her with companionship and entertainment in her private chambers. Let me sit with that for a moment. They were expected to put her needs above those of their own husbands and children. This was not a job. This was a vocation. It was more total in its demands than almost any professional commitment we would recognize today, and the hierarchy within the Queen's household was exquisitely precise. At the very top sat the mistress of the robes, usually a duchess, always someone of the highest possible rank. Below her came the ladies of the bedchamber, noble women who had actual physical access to the Queen's most private spaces. Then the women of the bedchamber, slightly lower in rank, but still inside the inner circle. And then further out, the maids of honor, usually younger, unmarried, still learning the game. Each level came with different privileges, different access, different information, and different danger. Because the closer you were to the Queen, the more you knew. And the more you knew, the more everyone wanted something from you. And the more everyone wanted something from you, the more carefully you had to walk. Here is something that surprised me when I was researching this. Historically, ladies-in-waiting had many duties and were expected to fulfill their responsibilities around the clock, even while their mistress was sleeping. It was not uncommon for one or more court ladies to share a sleeping space with a royal woman, around the clock, even while the Queen slept. Elizabeth I, Queen of England, one of the most formidable rulers in the history of Europe, did not sleep alone. Elizabeth, an unmarried monarch in a male-dominated society, shared her bedchamber with a trusted court lady, a decision that safeguarded both her safety and her reputation. Think about what that means in practice. Think about how much trust that requires. Think about how many secrets pass between two people who share a room in the darkest hours of the night. Elizabeth, who was brilliant and controlled in almost every other area of her life, reportedly suffered from bouts of insomnia and fear of the dark. And the person who sat with her through those nights, who heard her worries and her doubts and her fears in a way no ambassador or counselor ever would, was a lady-in-waiting. That woman carried knowledge that no official record would ever contain, and she knew it. Now, before I go any further, I want to address something because when most people think of this topic, they think of Europe, Tudor England, Versailles, the Spanish court, and those are absolutely part of our story tonight and in the episodes ahead. But the phenomenon of powerful women serving as political intermediaries under the guise of personal attendants, that is not a European story. That is a human story. In the Japanese imperial court of the Heian period, roughly between the years 794 and 1185, the women who served as ladies-in-waiting held roles that were in some ways even more remarkable than their European counterparts. In the royal Japanese courts, being a lady-in-waiting was not just a matter of household management, it was also a matter of state, as these women would also often serve as imperial secretaries. Imperial secretaries, not assistants, not companions, secretaries of state in everything but name. And perhaps the most famous lady-in-waiting in all of Japanese history, arguably in all of world history, was a woman named Murasaki Shikibu, a poet, a diarist, and a genius who served the Empress Shoshi at the beginning of the 11th century. While attending the Empress, she wrote something that no one had ever written before. A long, psychologically complex narrative about court life, love power, and the hidden inner worlds of people who existed on the margins of power. It is called The Tale of Genji, and scholars widely consider it the world's first novel written by a lady-in-waiting in stolen moments between her duties, while watching and waiting, and understanding everything around her. We're going to spend an entire chapter later on exploring that world in depth, but I want you to carry that image with you as we go. The first novel ever written on Earth was composed by a woman whose job title was essentially palace attendant. So, what does all of this add up to? Here is what I think, and this is where I get genuinely moved by this history. We have spent centuries telling a certain kind of story about power. We talk about kings and generals and popes and prime ministers. We paint their portraits, build their monuments, name our cities after them, and these stories matter. They are real, but they are incomplete. Because beside every throne in history, and I mean beside, not behind, there were women who understood something essential. Power does not always announce itself. It does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a quiet smile and a neatly folded letter, and knows exactly when the moment is right to say the thing that changes everything. The ladies-in-waiting were masters of that kind of power, and their story has been hiding in plain sight for centuries, in the rooms most people never looked into, in the margins of official histories, in the private letters that when they survived at all, survived almost by accident. Tonight, we are going to read those margins together. We're going to walk into those rooms, and I genuinely think you are going to find some of the most extraordinary human stories you have ever encountered. Because coming up next, we're going to pull back the curtain on what it actually took to become one of these women. Not just the etiquette lessons and the language classes, but the real education. The one that happened behind closed doors, watching, calculating, understanding a world where everything was a performance, and yet everything was also completely dangerously real. We're going to meet a 12-year-old girl sent alone to a foreign court. We're going to watch how she learns to read the room before she learns to read the queen. And we're going to understand why the making of a lady-in-waiting was in many ways the most sophisticated education a woman of that era could possibly receive. Stay right here. The next chapter begins now. Imagine you are 12 years old. You've just said goodbye to your mother. Not for a week, not for a summer, for the foreseeable future, which in the 16th century could mean the rest of your life. Your father has arranged everything. A position has been secured. A foreign court is expecting you, and the carriage is already waiting. Does that sound like an opportunity, or does it sound like something else entirely? Here is what fascinates me about this moment, and it happened to hundreds, maybe thousands of young women across 5 centuries of European history. The families who sent their daughters away like this did not think of it as loss. They thought of it as investment, the most important investment they could possibly make. Because a daughter placed inside a royal household was not just a daughter anymore. She was a bridge between her family and the crown, between the world outside the palace gates and the world within. And that bridge, if she was clever enough, careful enough, patient enough, could carry extraordinary things across it. So tonight, let us walk into the making of one of these women. Let us understand what she actually learned, and why the education she received in those gilded chambers was in many ways unlike anything else available to a woman of her time. Here is something I want you to sit with for a moment. In the 16th and 17th centuries, there were essentially 2 paths available to a woman of noble birth. You married ideally well, ideally quickly, or you entered the church. And both of those paths, for all their differences, had one thing in common. They placed you under the authority of someone else, in a world defined almost entirely by rules you did not write and could not change. But a lady-in-waiting, and this is the part that never quite gets talked about, a lady-in-waiting occupied a strange and genuinely unusual third space. She was noble, but she served. She was unmarried often, but she was not cloistered. She traveled. She attended diplomatic receptions. She met ambassadors, poets, cardinals, generals. She sat in rooms where the fate of kingdoms was quietly being decided over embroidered tablecloths and careful conversation. and she watched all of it. A historian named Carolyn Dunn, who spent years documenting the careers of nearly 1,200 ladies in waiting in England between 1236 and 1536, made a point that I keep coming back to. She described these women as, and I love this phrase, liminal but essential, on the threshold between worlds, belonging fully to neither, but indispensable to both. That liminality was not a weakness. It was the whole point. Now, what did the actual education look like? Because I think most of us, when we picture a young noble woman being prepared for court service, imagine something like a finishing school, posture lessons, needlework, perhaps a little music. And yes, all of those things were real. But the curriculum was so much deeper than that. Languages were foundational. Not one language, several. A lady-in-waiting at the Spanish court might need fluent Castilian working knowledge of French, and enough Latin to follow correspondence that crossed her path. At the English court under Elizabeth I, the expectation was similarly demanding. Elizabeth herself spoke 6 languages fluently: Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Spanish, and Welsh, and she expected the women around her to keep up. Can you imagine being a teenager sitting across from one of the most intellectually formidable women in European history and having to hold a conversation? No pressure. But beyond languages, there was something else being taught. Something that had no formal name, no textbook, no examination. Call it the art of reading people. A lady-in-waiting needed to understand in real time what was happening in any given room, who was allied with whom, who had fallen out of favor this week, and more importantly, why, whose word carried weight with the Queen today that it had not carried yesterday, when to offer an opinion, and when to become suddenly and gracefully almost invisible. This was not intuition, it was a learned skill, and it was practiced daily in an environment where getting it wrong had real consequences. There is a conduct book written in the 1580s by a man named Anibi Guasco for his 11-year-old daughter Lavinia, who had just been accepted as a lady-in-waiting at the court of Savoy. He wrote her a private rule-book, a guide for surviving and thriving in a world he knew she would need to navigate without him. And what strikes me about this document, which Lavinia later had published, incidentally making it one of the few surviving guides of its kind, is how practical it is, how shrewd. He does not spend much time on embroidery. He spends a great deal of time on discretion, on the difference between a confidence shared in friendship and a confidence shared as a test, on how to respond when someone tells you something private, not with excitement, not with too many questions, but with a calm, measured acknowledgement that makes you seem trustworthy, rather than hungry for information. 11 years old, being taught how to handle intelligence. That is not a finishing school, that is training. And here is where I want to introduce someone new to you. Someone whose name you may not know as well as Anne Boleyn's, but whose story illuminates this world from a completely different, and I think even more revealing angle. Her name is Catherine Willoughby, later known as Catherine, Duchess of Suffolk. She entered the household of Catherine of Aragon at the age of 7 years old. Her father had died. Her wardship, essentially the legal right to manage her future and her marriage, had been purchased by Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, and one of King Henry VIII's closest friends. When Brandon's wife Mary died, Mary being not incidentally the former Queen of France, and the King's own sister Brandon, married his ward Catherine Willoughby, who was at that point 14 years old, and who had been living in his household since she was a small child. Now I want to be careful here, because history is messy, and we are looking at it through a modern lens. But what I find extraordinary about Catherine's story is not the marriage, troubling as that is by contemporary standards. It is what she did afterward. Catherine became one of the most outspoken Protestant reformers in England. She used her position, her wealth, her access, and her connections, all of which she'd cultivated through years of court life, beginning in childhood, to protect reformers from persecution, to fund the translation of Protestant texts, and eventually to go into exile, rather than compromise her beliefs when the Catholic Queen Mary took the throne. She was not a victim of the court system. She had learned its rules so thoroughly that she could use them on her own terms. That is the education a ladies-in-waiting received, Not just how to curtsy, how to survive. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to perform one version of yourself while thinking something completely different on the inside? Where you had to smile at someone and keep your expression perfectly neutral while your mind was working through something much more complicated? Most of us have had moments like that. Maybe a difficult family dinner, maybe a meeting at work, maybe just navigating a relationship that required more patience than you actually felt. Now imagine doing that every single day from childhood, in a room full of other people who were doing the exact same thing with much, much higher stakes than a difficult dinner. That was the daily reality of a lady in waiting. And the women who mastered it, who could hold that internal complexity behind an expression of perfect serenity, those women became extraordinary. Not in spite of the constraints placed on them, because of what those constraints demanded of them. Now the specific duties these women performed were varied enough to be genuinely surprising. On the surface level, yes, they helped the queen dress. They managed her correspondence. They accompanied her to chapel, to meals, to formal receptions. They entertained her in the evenings with music and reading and cards. But woven through all of that invisibly and constantly was something else entirely. They were gathering information. Every conversation at a royal reception was an opportunity to understand the mood of the court. Every letter they helped draft or received was a window into the queen's mind. Every nobleman who approached them to ask a favor. And they were approached constantly because getting to the queen through a lady-in-waiting was so much easier than approaching the queen directly. Every one of those encounters was a data point in a map of power that a skilled lady-in-waiting was always drawing. And the queens knew this. The relationship was not naive on either side. Queens expected their ladies to be well-connected, socially active, informationally rich, because the queen herself could not always be everywhere, hear everything, know what was being said 3 rooms over. Her ladies were her network, her distributed intelligence, and in return the queens monitored their ladies just as carefully. They knew which lady was close to which lord, which family had recently allied with which faction, which of their attendants might under pressure serve 2 masters. It was, if I am being honest, a little bit like a very elegant, very prolonged, very carefully dressed game of chess, played with real people for real stakes. Here is a detail I find almost poetic in its specificity. In the Spanish court of the 16th century, one of the most ceremony-obsessed royal establishments in Europe, the etiquette around the queen's daily routine was so precisely codified that there were written rules governing exactly who was permitted to hand the queen her gloves. Her gloves. The specific lady who was allowed to present the gloves, in what order it happened, with what gesture, at what point in the morning ritual. Now, I can imagine what you might be thinking. That sounds completely absurd. That is an enormous amount of formality around a pair of gloves. But here is the thing. That absurdity was entirely intentional. Because every detail of the ritual, who stood, where, who touched, what, who walked with the queen, and who waited at the door, was a public declaration of hierarchy, a living, breathing organizational chart, performed every single day. The woman who handed the queen her gloves was not just handing over gloves. She was demonstrating to everyone watching that she was trusted, that she had access, that her family was in favor. And the woman who used to hand the queen her gloves, and no longer did, everyone noticed that too. You did not need an announcement. You did not need a newspaper. The gloves told the story. There is one more figure I want to bring into this chapter, because she represents, I think, something that does not get talked about enough in the history of this institution. Her name is Beatriz de Bobadilla, and she was by most accounts the most powerful lady-in-waiting in the history of the Spanish crown. Beatriz grew up alongside Isabella of Castile, the woman who had become with her husband Ferdinand of Aragon, the ruler of a unified Spain, and the monarch who funded Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas. They had known each other since childhood, which meant that when Isabella became queen, Beatriz was not just a servant. She was the person Isabella had grown up with, the person who knew her before the crown. That kind of intimacy is its own form of power. untransferable, irreplaceable. Beatrice served as Isabella's most trusted confidant throughout her reign, accompanying her on military campaigns, managing diplomatic correspondence, and acting at various points as an informal ambassador. She was tough, fiercely loyal, and according to contemporary accounts, genuinely intimidating. When Columbus's first voyage was being financed and debated at court, Beatrice was in the room. She's almost entirely absent from the textbooks, because the textbooks were written later by people who are looking at the official records, and the official records mostly track the names with the official titles. The woman who helped make it all possible. She was listed, if she was listed at all, as a lady of the Queen's household. That erasure, quiet, systematic, unintentional in some ways, but total in its effect, is part of why this history matters so much. Because the more you look, the more you find women like Beatrice everywhere, in every court, in every century, in every country, present for the decisions, absent from the credit. So here is what I want to leave you with, as we close this chapter. The making of a lady-in-waiting was not about creating a decorative presence. It was about forging a specific kind of human being, patient, perceptive, disciplined, in a way that most people never have to be, because most people are never required to perform their composure for an audience every day for years. These women were educated in observation, in discretion, in the management of information, in the navigation of proximity to power, and many of them far more than history gives credit for. Use that education to extraordinary effect, not loudly, not with declarations or proclamations, but with a whispered word at the right moment. A letter quietly passed, a hand steadied on a queen's arm in a dark corridor when the world outside felt like it was falling apart. That is not small illness. That is a different kind of greatness. And the next chapter, we are going inside the most private room in any royal palace, the bedchamber. Because it turns out that the right to help a queen put on her stockings in the morning was in one very specific and absolutely real historical moment, the center of a constitutional crisis that nearly brought down the British government. No, I am not exaggerating. We are going there next. There is a room in every royal palace that almost no one talks about. Not the throne room, with its soaring ceilings and painted gods floating overhead. Not the grand dining hall, where ambassadors were dazzled and alliances were sealed over roasted swan. Not the chapel, not the portrait gallery, not the reception chamber with its choreographed processions and powdered wigs. The room I am talking about is smaller, warmer. It smells of wood smoke and lavender water, and something else, something harder to name, the particular scent of privacy. It is the bedchamber, and in the politics of the royal court, the bedchamber was not a place of rest. It was a battlefield. Let me tell you about a morning in the life of a queen, not a dramatic morning, an ordinary one. She wakes before the sun is fully up. There are already women in the room. They have been there through the night in shifts because a royal woman is never truly alone. The fire has been tended. The water has been heated. The clothing for the day has been selected, pressed, and laid out in a sequence that has been agreed upon, argued over, and eventually codified into something approaching ceremony. Now the ritual begins. The queen does not dress herself. She's never dressed herself, not since she was old enough for this to matter. Each garment is handed to her by a specific woman. The order matters. The hierarchy of who touches what, who stands, where who speaks, and who remains silent, all of it is understood, rehearsed, and absolutely deliberate. To an outsider, it might look like an elaborate way to put on clothes. To anyone who understood the court, it was something else entirely. It was a daily public declaration of trust, rank, and power. And on one particular morning in the year 1839, this ritual, this seemingly domestic, seemingly trivial ritual, cracked the British government almost completely in two. The story is called the Bedchamber Crisis. And if you have never heard of it, I want you to know that it is one of my favorite stories in all of political history. Partly because it is genuinely consequential, but mostly because it sounds on the surface so magnificently absurd. Queen Victoria had just turned 20 years old. She had been on the throne for less than 2 years. She was young. She was strong-willed. She was, by many contemporary accounts, not particularly interested in being told what to do. Her Prime Minister at the time was Lord Melbourne, a Whig, and Victoria adored him. He was charming, paternal, endlessly patient with her questions about governance, and politically, he was a perfect match for her inclinations. But Melbourne's government fell, and the man expected to replace him was Sir Robert Peel, the leader of the Tory party. Peel went to the Queen to begin forming a new government. And here is where it gets interesting. He made a request that in retrospect was politically reasonable, even standard, but that landed with Victoria like a declaration of war. He asked her to replace some of her ladies of the bedchamber. Not all of them, some of them, the ones who were wives and relatives of prominent Whig politicians, because Peel was forming a Tory government and having the Queen surrounded in her most private moments by the wives of his political opponents, struck him quite correctly as a problem. Victoria refused, not diplomatically, not with careful political maneuvering. She refused flatly immediately, and with a fury that reportedly left Peel shaken. She wrote to Melbourne, her beloved outgoing Prime Minister, in terms that left no ambiguity about her feelings. She said that she would sooner abdicate than submit to such an indignity. And here is the extraordinary thing. She won. Peel withdrew. Melbourne returned to power, and Queen Victoria kept her ladies of the bedchamber exactly as they were. The government of the United Kingdom was reshaped, or rather, prevented from reshaping itself, because a 20-year-old queen refused to change the women who helped her get dressed in the morning. Now, was Victoria being politically naive? Was she being strategically brilliant? Was she simply being as young, powerful people, sometimes or both, at once? Historians have argued about this for nearly 2 centuries, but here is my honest read on it. Victoria understood something that Peel may have underestimated. She understood that the bedchamber was not separate from politics. It was politics, the most intimate, most constant, most ungovernable form of political influence there was, and she was not willing to surrender it. The bedchamber crisis is dramatic enough on its own, but did not happen in a vacuum. It was the latest chapter in a story that stretched back at least 300 years. The story of why physical proximity to power was itself a form of power, and why the people who controlled that proximity guarded it so fiercely. Let me take you back to the Tudor court, because this is where the architecture of the royal bed, chamber as a political space, was really built under Henry VIII. The Privy Chamber, the room immediately adjacent to the royal bedroom, was the most coveted space in England. The men who served in Henry's Privy Chamber, who handed him his shirts and accompanied him on his morning walks, and sat with him in his most unguarded moments. Those men were among the most powerful figures in the kingdom, not because of their official titles, because of their access. And the women's equivalent of this space, the Queen's bedchamber, the Queen's Privy Chamber, operated on exactly the same logic. The woman who was present when the Queen woke up, when the Queen was tired, when the Queen was unwell, when the Queen was frightened or angry or uncertain, that woman had access to a version of the Queen that no ambassador, no minister, no official of any kind ever saw. That access was priceless, literally priceless. You could not buy it. You could only be given it. And it was given based on trust, on family connection, on the slow accumulation of demonstrated loyalty. Here is a question that I think about a lot. What does it feel like to be that trusted? To be the person a queen allows to see her without the performance, without the crown and the composure and the carefully calibrated public face? I think it must have been extraordinary, and I think it must have been terrifying, because trust in the royal court was never unconditional. It was extended carefully, slowly, and it could be withdrawn in an instant. The women who served in the innermost chambers knew more about their queens than anyone else. Alive, they knew which mornings were dark ones. They knew which letters made the queen's hands shake. They knew sometimes things that no one else in the palace was supposed to know. And that knowledge, that intimate accumulated unchosen knowledge, was both their greatest asset and their greatest vulnerability. Because if a queen fell from power, or if a political wind shifted, or if a new favorite emerged, and the old arrangements were swept away, The women who had been closest to the center were often the most exposed. They had no official position to protect them, no legal standing derived from their service, just the goodwill of a woman whose goodwill was itself subject to the pressures of a world neither of them fully controlled. That is a strange kind of job security. Let me tell you about a woman named Kat Ashley. Her full name was Catherine Ashley, and she was by any measure one of the most important figures in the early life of Elizabeth I. She came into Elizabeth's household when Elizabeth was a small child, perhaps 4 years old, and she served her for 30 years until Ashley's own death in the year 1565. Kat Ashley was not just a lady-in-waiting, she was Elizabeth's primary caregiver through the most dangerous years of the princess's childhood. She taught Elizabeth to read. She taught her to write. She sat with her through fevers. She managed her household when Elizabeth had no household of her own worth speaking of, and she got into serious trouble twice for her loyalty. The first time Ashley was arrested and sent to the Tower of London in the year 1549, when she was suspected of knowing about a potentially compromising relationship between the young princess and Thomas Seymour, the Lord High Admiral, who'd been making dangerously familiar advances toward the teenage Elizabeth. Ashley was questioned. She insisted she had done nothing wrong. She was eventually released. But the arrest, the interrogation, the weeks in the Tower, those were not abstract political inconveniences. That was genuine danger, and yet she went back. She went back to Elizabeth's service because that was where her loyalty lived, and she was not the kind of woman who walked away from it because the road had gotten rough. When Elizabeth finally became queen in 1558, she immediately appointed Kat Ashley as First Lady of the Bedchamber, the highest position in the Queen's private household, given without hesitation to the woman who had read her bedtime stories when she was 4 years old. There is something about that continuity, that arc from childhood caregiver to the most intimate position in a royal court, that I find genuinely moving. Power took many forms in that world, but so did devotion. And sometimes, in the right circumstances, devotion turned out to be the most durable power of all. Now, I want to pause for just a moment and ask you something directly, because I think this is worth reflecting on. We talk a lot in our modern world about the people who are in the room where it happens. That phrase from the musical, you know the one. The idea that proximity to decision-making is itself a form of participation in history. The ladies-in-waiting were in many ways the original version of that idea. They were in the room, not the official room, not the room the history books later focused on, but the room before that room. The room where the Queen composed herself before she walked into the official room, where she made the final decision about what to say, where she sometimes quietly changed her mind. Does that feel familiar to you at all? Have you ever been the person someone trusted enough to think out loud with the person they called before the important meeting, not during it? The person who saw the unfinished version of decisions that the world later saw as definitive and certain. If you have, then you have in some small and modern and considerably less fraught way occupied the space that these women occupied, and it is a particular kind of influence, quieter than the official kind, harder to name, but real. There is one more aspect of the bedchamber dynamic that I want to explore before we move forward, and it is, I think, the most quietly remarkable one. The bedchamber was not just the place where the Queen was most vulnerable, it was the place where she was most herself. Queens of the early modern period lived in a state of almost continuous performance. Every meal was an event. Every walk through the palace was observed. Every word spoken in a public setting was weighed and interpreted and reported on by people whose entire professional existence was dedicated to watching them. The private chamber, and specifically the bedchamber, was the one space where the performance could be briefly partially suspended. Not entirely, never entirely, because the ladies-in-waiting were there, and they were watching too in their own way, but the register shifted. The mask, if you want to call it that, could be loosened slightly. A queen could admit in the intimacy of her own rooms to being tired, to being worried, to being uncertain about his decision that in public she had presented as unquestionable. Mary I of England, the Queen, known to history as Bloody Mary, though that particular name tells you much more about her Protestant enemies than it tells you about her suffered deeply during her reign. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain was politically advantageous and personally miserable. She experienced what she believed were two pregnancies that turned out not to be pregnancies at all. Episodes that historians now suspect may have been psychological in origin, given the extraordinary pressures she was under. And through all of this, her ladies-in-waiting were present, specifically a woman named Susan Clarence, who served as her mistress of the robes and was by all accounts her closest companion. When Mary was in pain, Susan Clarence was there. When Mary wept, and she wept, records suggest more than the official portraits would ever indicate, Susan was there. When Mary finally understood in the last months of her life that she was dying, and that the Protestant half-sister she had imprisoned and mistrusted would inherit everything she had struggled to build, Susan Clarence was in the room. She witnessed the private dissolution of a queen who in public was expected to embody strength and conviction until the very end. That witness, that quiet, faithful, humanizing witness, is itself a form of historical importance. Even if Susan Clarence barely appears in the history books, even if the portraits painted of Mary show her alone composed queenly, the truth of those years existed in the bedchamber with the women who were there. So, let us hold all of this together for a moment before we move on. The bedchamber was not a domestic space dressed up as a political one. It was a political space, one of the most consequential in any royal court that happened to also be domestic. The women who served in it were not peripheral figures, softened by proximity to power. They were central figures whose centrality was expressed through proximity rather than through official title. They navigated one of the most demanding positions imaginable, trusted completely, but never entirely safe. Invisible in the official record, but present for the moments that shaped it. Required to witness everything, and speak of almost nothing, and what they left behind in letters, in diaries, in the occasional memoir, in the gaps between official documents, where you can feel their presence, even when you cannot quite name it. What they left behind is a different kind of history. Not the history of declarations and battles and treaties, the history of what it felt like to be there, to be close, to watch the machinery of power from the inside. And that history, I would argue, is every bit as important as the official version, maybe more so, which brings us to something I find almost irresistible, and I suspect you will, too, because while the bedchamber was the most intimate space in the palace, there was another arena where ladies-in-waiting exercise power that was even bolder, even more complex, and in at least one extraordinary case, even more decisive for the fate of nations. We are talking about influence. Direct, calculated, brilliantly executed political influence. The kind that never showed up in official records. The kind that moved kings without ever touching a crown. The kind that history spent centuries pretending did not exist. That is exactly where we are headed next. There is a word in French that means to whisper. And if I had to pick a single word to describe how real political power moved through a royal court, I think that would be it. Not shouted from a throne, not declared in a council chamber, not printed in an official decree stamped with a royal seal, whispered in corridors, in carriages, in the brief, private, unrepeatable moments between a queen and the woman standing closest to her. We spent the last chapter inside the bedchamber, that intimate space where proximity to power was its own form of power. But now I want to take you somewhere even more revealing. Because the bedchamber was where influence was held. What I want to show you now is how it was used. Let us begin with a woman whose reputation has been filtered, distorted, and dramatized so many times over the centuries that finding the real person underneath requires a bit of careful excavation. Her name is Diane d'Eoy. And before I say another word about her, I want to give you one fact that stops most people cold when they first encounter it. When Diane d'Eoy became the most powerful woman at the French court, not the queen, not a princess, but a lady of the court, she was 19 years older than the king she influenced. 19 years. In a world that celebrated youth and women above almost everything else, in a court that valued beauty as a political currency, as real as gold, Diane de Poitiers held the attention, the devotion, and the political ear of King Henry II of France for more than 2 decades. How the question is worth sitting with, because the easy answer, the one that gossip columns of the 16th century loved, and that certain historical novels still prefer, is that it was simply about physical attraction. But that answer is lazy, and it does not hold up when you actually look at what Diane accomplished. Diane de Poitiers was born in the year 1499. She came from a noble family in the Dauphin region of France, well-connected but not spectacularly wealthy, the kind of background that made ambition not just reasonable, but necessary. She was appointed lady-in-waiting to the French Queen Claude of France in her early teens, and from that position she observed, she learned. She built relationships with extraordinary patience and precision. When Henry became king in 1547, the same year his father Francis I died, Diane was already a fixture of the court, not a newcomer, not an outsider trying to find her footing. She was a woman who understood the machinery of French royal power more intimately than almost anyone alive, and she used that understanding masterfully through her relationship with Henry, which was openly acknowledged at court, openly tolerated by the Queen Catherine de' Medici, in a display of pragmatic acceptance that I find both admirable and quietly heartbreaking. Diane became, in practical terms, the co-architect of French royal policy. She managed the king's correspondence. She influenced appointments. She directed the flow of patronage that determined which families rose and which stagnated. She even controlled at various points the royal treasury, and used that control to commission some of the most extraordinary art and architecture of the French Renaissance, including the Château d'Art, which was built specifically for her and remains standing to this day. Here is my personal read on Diane de Poitiers. She's often described as a seductress, a manipulator, a woman who leveraged charm to extract power. But I think that framing gets it backwards. What Diane had was not charm deployed in service of ambition. It was competence, genuine, demonstrated, indispensable competence wrapped in the only form that the 16th century would accept from a woman. She could not be a minister. She could not hold an official title. She could not stand in the council chamber and argue policy as herself. So she became instead the person the king trusted most, and she made sure that trust was earned, repeatedly, over decades. That is not manipulation. That is adaptation. Brilliant, costly, and in its own way deeply human adaptation. But Diane's story, remarkable as it is, represents only one model of how ladies-in-waiting exercise political influence. And honestly, the model I find even more interesting, more complex, more morally layered, and more revealing about the actual mechanics of court power, is the one that involved not a single woman with sustained influence, but a coordinated network of women operating simultaneously, which brings us inevitably to Catherine de' Medici. Now, Catherine de' Medici is one of those historical figures who has been so thoroughly mythologized that almost everything people think they know about her requires some untangling. She was Italian, born in Florence in 1519, into the extraordinarily wealthy and powerful Medici banking family. She came to France as a teenager to marry the future Henry II, the same Henry II who had later become so devoted to Diane de Poitiers. So, Catherine spent the early decades of her marriage in the shadow of her husband's more celebrated companion. She was politically marginalized, personally humiliated in ways that court etiquette required her to absorb with a composure that must have been almost superhuman. And then Henry died in the year 1559, in a jousting accident. A lance fragment pierced his visor during a tournament, and he died 10 days later, and Catherine de' Medici, who had spent 30 years being underestimated, became Queen Regent of France. She served in that role, effectively governing one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe for the better part of 3 decades, through the reigns of 3 of her sons, and one of the instruments she used most deliberately was her ladies-in-waiting. The group became known in contemporary accounts and later, in historical literature, as the Escadron Volant, the Flying Squadron. The name alone tells you something. These were not passive attendants. They were active agents. Women selected by Catherine specifically for their intelligence, their social skills, their ability to move through the court without attracting the wrong kind of attention, and then deployed with specific intentions into specific situations. The flying squadron numbered somewhere between 80 women at its peak, a remarkable figure when you consider that the entire premise was strategic social navigation rather than domestic service, and the intelligence they gathered fed directly back to Catherine. Now, here is where I want to be careful and honest, because history demands both. The flying squadron has over the centuries attracted some extraordinarily dramatic accusations. The most sensational accounts, many of them written by Catherine's enemies, which is worth noting, suggest that these women were essentially operatives of seduction, deployed to compromise powerful men and extract secrets. Some of those accounts are certainly exaggerated. Political enemies have always found it useful to paint their opponents as sexually corrupt, and Catherine had no shortage of enemies who are very motivated to blacken her reputation in any way available to them. But completely dismissing the political intelligence function of the flying squadron would also be naive. What seems most historically credible, based on the records that survive the letters, the diplomatic dispatches, the memoirs, is something more nuanced and frankly more interesting than either extreme. Catherine built a network of educated, observant, socially adept women who were present in the spaces where French court politics actually happened. Dinner tables, carriage rides, evening entertainments, the informal conversations that preceded and followed official meetings. And those women reported what they saw and heard, not as spies in some theatrical sense, as informed observers feeding information to a woman who was trying to hold a fractured kingdom. Together, during one of the most violent and religiously divided periods of French history. Is that shocking? Or is it simply what effective governance looks like when the person doing the governing has been systematically excluded from every official channel? I want to pause here and bring in a parallel story from a completely different part of the world, because one of the things that strikes me most about this history is how consistently the same dynamic appears across cultures and centuries. Wherever you find a royal court with a powerful woman at its center in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, there was a period known as the Sultanate of Women. It lasted roughly from 1530 to 1720, nearly 200 years, during which the mothers, wives, and female relatives of the Ottoman sultans exercised what contemporary observers described as extraordinary and sometimes decisive influence over the empire's direction. The most famous of these women is Hurrem Sultan, known in European accounts as Roxolana, who began her life as a captive brought to the Ottoman court in the early 1500s, and ended it as the legally married wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, an achievement so unprecedented in Ottoman court history that contemporaries genuinely did not know what to make of it. But the mechanism of her influence was not simply proximity to Suleiman. Though that proximity was essential, it was the network she built within the imperial harem, which was not, despite what centuries of lurid European accounts would have you believe, primarily a place of romantic entertainment. The harem of the Ottoman palace was, in structural terms, remarkably similar to the ladies-in-waiting system of European courts. It was a hierarchical, highly organized household of women presided over by the Sultan's mother, the Valida Sultan, and organized according to rank, function, and proximity to power. The women within it gathered information, they built alliances, they managed the social environment in which the Sultan spent his private hours, and the most skilled among them shaped the world the Sultan saw, the advisors he trusted, and shaped critically the sons who would eventually compete for the throne. Hurrem Sultan navigated this environment with a precision that left contemporaries astonished and frequently terrified. She corresponded directly with foreign rulers. Letters between her and Sigismund II of Poland survive to this day. She commissioned major public works, including a mosque complex, a hospital, and a public bath in Jerusalem, funded with her personal wealth, designed to extend Ottoman charitable reach, and, not incidentally, her own legacy. And she did all of this from within a system that officially recognized no formal political role for women at all. Does that sound familiar? Here is the thing that I keep coming back to every time I look at this history. The women we have been talking about, Diane de Thierry, Catherine de' Medici, Hurrem Sultan, and dozens of others, were operating in systems that were explicitly designed to concentrate official power in the hands of men. These were not systems that accidentally overlooked women. They were systems that deliberately, structurally, and with considerable legal reinforcement, excluded women from official channels of power. And yet, the influence flowed anyway, not despite the restrictions, but in some genuinely paradoxical way partly through them, because the restrictions pushed women's influence into spaces that were harder to monitor, harder to counteract, and in many ways, harder to eliminate than official power ever is. Official power can be taken away, a title can be revoked, a position can be abolished, a political appointment can be reversed with a single decree. But the influence of a woman who has spent 20 years being the most trusted person in the room, that is not a title, it is a relationship. And relationships are much harder to legislate out of existence. Let me tell you about one more figure before we close this chapter, because she represents, I think, the purest and most quietly devastating example of political influence exercised through the lady-in-waiting role that I have ever encountered. Her name is Frances Douane. She's better known to history as Madame de Manor. She was born in the year 1635 in a prison. Her father was incarcerated at the time of her birth. He was not by any measure a success story. She spent parts of her childhood in poverty, significant enough to be genuinely destabilizing. She was widowed young, left with very little, and came to the court of Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, the most powerful monarch in Europe, as the governess of his illegitimate children. A governess, not even a lady-in-waiting in the formal sense, a woman paid to look after children that the official court barely acknowledged. And from that position, from that almost invisible starting point, Frances Douane became, over the course of roughly 15 years, the secret wife of Louis XIV. Not his mistress in the way that term was understood at the time, his wife. Secretly married after the death of Queen Mahita in 1683. Never publicly acknowledged because the political complications would have been insurmountable but real, and her influence on Louis in the final decades of his reign. He died in 1715, after a reign of 72 years, was profound enough that contemporaries debated whether the increasingly conservative, increasingly religious character of the late Sun King was the genuine evolution of an old man, or the reflection of the woman who spent every evening in conversation with him. The historian and memoir writer Sansim himself, a courtier who observed the reign of Louis XIV with an extraordinarily sharp eye, wrote about Maintenon with a mixture of astonishment and barely concealed fury. He believed she was the true power behind the final decades of the most absolutist monarchy Europe had ever seen. Whether that is entirely accurate, or partly the resentment of a man who did not like being outmaneuvered by a woman, I leave for you to decide, but the facts are not in serious dispute. Frances Douane, born in a prison, widowed in poverty, appointed as a governess, ended her life as the secret wife of the Sun King, resident of the Palace of Versailles, founder of Lee, a school for impoverished girls that she ran herself and that outlasted the monarchy centuries. The school, the Institut National de Saint Louis, was established in 1686 and educated girls until the French Revolution. A version of it still exists today. That is not a footnote. That is a life of extraordinary consequence, built from almost nothing through exactly the kind of quiet, patient, relentless cultivation of trust and proximity that define the very best of what ladies-in-waiting accomplished. So what is the pattern here? I think it is this. When official channels are closed, influence does not disappear. It finds another way. It flows through the personal, the intimate, the relational, the carefully cultivated. The ladies-in-waiting, who exercised real political power, were not subverting the system. They were completing it, filling in the spaces that official structures left empty, carrying out functions that courts needed performed, whether or not they were willing to officially acknowledge who was performing them. Their influence was real, its effects were measurable, and the fact that it was exercised quietly, without title, without official recognition, does not make it smaller. If anything, and this is the part I find genuinely remarkable, the absence of official recognition may have made it more durable, because it was harder to attack, harder to remove, harder to see coming. And speaking of things that are harder to see coming, in the next chapter, we're going to look at something that has been quietly present in everything we have discussed so far, but that we have not yet examined directly: the role of fashion. And I do not mean fashion in the way we usually talk about it, as aesthetics, as taste, as a reflection of personal style. I mean fashion as language, as weaponry, as a system of communication, so sophisticated that the women who understood it could send messages across a crowded room without saying a single word. Because in the royal court, what you wore was not a choice. It was a statement. And sometimes, just sometimes, it was the most dangerous statement you could possibly make. That story is coming right up. Picture this for a moment. You walk into a room. You have not said a single word. You have not greeted anyone, have not made eye contact, have not offered so much as a nod in anyone's direction. And yet, every person in that room already knows something about you, who you are aligned with, whether you're in favor or out of it, whether you're confident or quietly desperate, whether you're making a statement or issuing a warning. They know all of this before you open your mouth, because they read it off your body, off the color of your gown, the fabric at your collar, the jewels at your throat, or the deliberate, pointed absence of them. In the royal courts of early modern Europe, clothing was not fashion, it was a language, and the women who understood that language, who could read it and write it and deploy it with precision, had access to a form of communication that was almost impossible to intercept, almost impossible to prove, and almost impossible to defend against. Welcome to the most elegant battlefield you have never thought about. Let me give you some context first, because the rules of this system were specific, and they were real. In 16th and 17th century Europe, what you wore was not simply a matter of personal taste or financial capacity. It was regulated. The laws governing dress, called sumptuary laws, from the Latin word for expenditure, dictated, with remarkable precision, who was allowed to wear what. In England, under the Tudor monarchs, these laws were extraordinarily detailed. Only members of the royal family were permitted to wear purple silk. Only those of the rank of earl or above could wear cloth of gold in certain configurations. The use of certain furs, sable for example, was restricted to specific ranks of nobility. Violating these laws was not a minor social faux power, it was a legal offense. You could be fined in some cases. You could face more serious consequences. Now, here is the first thing that strikes me about this system. Yes, the laws were meant to maintain visible social hierarchy, to make sure at a glance that anyone in a room could read exactly who was who in the order of things. But what they actually created, quite unintentionally, was a system in which clothing became a political statement, precisely because it was so heavily regulated. When everyone knows the rules, breaking them, or bending them, or finding the edges of them with exquisite deliberateness, becomes its own form of language. And no one in the Tudor court understood this more completely than Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I is in many ways the supreme master of clothing as political communication. And what is particularly interesting to me, in the context of tonight's story, is how much of that mastery was expressed through the system of ladies-in-waiting rather than through Elizabeth herself alone. By the later decades of her reign, Elizabeth had accumulated somewhere in the region of 2,000 gowns. 2,000. That number is staggering even by the standards of royal excess, and historians have noted that it was not simply vanity that drove it. Each gown was a tool. Each one was selected for specific occasions, specific audiences, specific messages. And the women who surrounded Elizabeth, her ladies of the bedchamber, her maids of honor, were dressed in significant part as extensions of the Queen herself. Elizabeth exercised strict control over what her ladies wore in her presence. If a lady appeared in a color or a fabric that Elizabeth had not approved, or worse, in something that competed with the Queen's own carefully constructed visual statement for the day, the consequences were swift and personal. There is a documented episode recorded in the letters and memoirs of the period in which Elizabeth noticed one of her ladies wearing a particularly fine dress that she felt was too close to her own splendor. The Queen reportedly removed the offending garment herself, right there in front of everyone. Now, was that petty? Perhaps a little, I will admit it. But it was also a message delivered publicly, unmistakably, and without a single word of official explanation. The message was in this room. The visual hierarchy is mine to control, and anyone who forgets that will be reminded. The color white deserves a particular moment in this story, because its use in the Elizabeth and court was one of the most sophisticated examples of clothing as communication I have ever encountered. White in the 16th century was not simply a color, it was a symbol of purity, of virginity, of almost sacred untouchability. Elizabeth, who had built her entire public identity around the concept of the Virgin Queen, the monarch married to England rather than to any man, used white with extraordinary deliberateness, and she extended that symbolism carefully to the women around her. Her maids of honor, young unmarried women serving in her court, were often dressed in white or pale colors that echoed the Queen's own visual identity. They became, in a sense, a visual chorus surrounding her, amplifying her symbolic presence, making the statement larger than any single figure could make it. This was branding in the most precise modern sense of the word, 500 years before anyone used that term. But here is the darker side of that arrangement. The maids of honor who served Elizabeth were expected to maintain their unmarried status while at court, and the Queen enforced this with a ferocity that in the 21st century would seem genuinely astonishing. When one of her ladies formed a secret attachment, or, and this was the truly unforgivable thing, when a lady secretly married without the Queen's, Elizabeth's response was not merely displeasure, it was fury, cold, total, and lasting. A woman named Mary Shelton secretly married James Scudamore in the 1580s without Elizabeth's knowledge. When the Queen found out, she reportedly struck Shelton, breaking one of her fingers. The marriage was not recognized at court for years. Another lady, Mary Howard, was confined to her rooms for daring to marry without permission. And Lettice Knollys, who we mentioned briefly in an earlier chapter, was banished from court entirely. When it emerged she had secretly married Robert Dudley, a man Elizabeth herself was known to favor. Elizabeth never forgave her. Lettice did not return to the Queen's court for nearly 20 years. Now, why does this matter in the context of clothing and visual communication? Because the control Elizabeth exercised over her ladies' appearance and their personal lives were expressions of the same underlying principle. The ladies-in-waiting were not just attendants. In Elizabeth's court, they were part of the Queen's living visual argument about who she was and what she represented. Their clothing, their status, their unmarried availability, all of it fed into the larger statement Elizabeth was making about herself to the world. And any woman who disrupted that statement, who introduced a competing narrative through an unauthorized marriage or an unapproved gown, was not just making a personal choice, she was puncturing the image, and that was something Elizabeth would not tolerate. But fashion in the royal court was not only a tool wielded by the powerful over those beneath them. Sometimes, in the most extraordinary cases, it flowed the other way. And I want to tell you about one particular woman whose use of clothing as a political instrument was so brilliant, so brave, and ultimately so devastating in its consequences that I find myself thinking about her regularly. Her name is Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, Mary's story is one of the most tragic in European history, and we're going to give it the full attention it deserves in a later chapter when we look at the price of loyalty. But right now, I want to focus on one specific moment. The morning of February 6th, in the year 1587, the morning of her execution, Mary had been imprisoned by her cousin Elizabeth I for nearly 20 years. She'd been tried for allegedly conspiring against the English Queen. She had been convicted, and now she was walking to the block in the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle. The room was full of witnesses, English nobles, and officials present to observe and to report back, and every single one of them was watching to see how she would behave. Would she weep? Would she beg? Would she collapse into the kind of undignified distress that would confirm in the minds of those watching that she had deserved her fate? Mary, Queen of Scots, walked into that room wearing black, a black gown deeply appropriate for mourning, for solemnity, for a queen meeting her end with dignity. And then she removed it. Underneath was a gown of deep crimson red. In the Catholic tradition, Mary was Catholic, and her faith was at the center of her identity and her political story. Crimson was the color of martyrdom, the color worn by those who died for their beliefs. She had planned this. She had chosen this color deliberately, had worn it beneath the black, knowing that when the black came off, the room would understand immediately what she was saying. She was not a traitor being executed by a queen. She was a martyr dying for her faith. That is an argument made entirely in fabric, delivered at the most extreme possible moment to an audience that could not unhear it. The witnesses at her execution reported this detail. It spread across Catholic Europe within weeks. It became part of how she was remembered as a queen who at the very end refused to let anyone else write the final sentence of her story. That is not vanity. That is courage expressed in the only medium available to her in that moment. Now I want to come back to the ladies and waiting, specifically because while the queens used fashion as a tool, their ladies operated within this system in ways that were even more nuanced, and in some ways even more interesting. A lady in waiting navigated a dress code that was simultaneously strict and politically charged. She had to present herself well enough to reflect credit on the queen she served. She could not outshine the queen. She had to signal her own family's status and wealth through her appearance. But she could not appear so wealthy that it created awkwardness around the source of that wealth. And she had to read constantly the visual landscape of the room she was in. Who was wearing the queen's colors? Who had shifted to a different palette? Which families were displaying their wealth more conspicuously than usual? And what did that signal about their current confidence? Which woman had arrived today in noticeably simpler dress than she had worn last week? And was that a financial difficulty, a strategic move, or a signal of some kind of submission? The court was visually a constantly updating map of alliances and standings, and the ladies who could read that map fluently had access to information that no official document would ever contain. There is a detail from the Spanish court of Philip II, the same Philip who would later marry Mary I of England, that I find remarkable in its specificity. At the Spanish court, ladies in waiting were required to wear the guardenfante, an extraordinarily wide skirt supported by a hooped underskirt that could extend several feet on either side of the wearer. These skirts were enormous, genuinely, almost comically enormous. Paintings of the period show ladies in gowns so wide they could barely fit through doorways side of wear. The official explanation was modesty. The wide skirt obscured the female form. But in practice, as historians of the Spanish court have noted, the guardenfante served a secondary function that was entirely political. It made it physically impossible to move quickly, to kneel spontaneously, to reach someone easily, to approach the queen without a significant degree of deliberate visible preparation. Every interaction, in other words, had to be choreographed. The body itself was regulated by the garment. Spontaneity, which is the enemy of controlled, legible social hierarchy, was architecturally prevented. I find this deeply fascinating because it reveals how completely the system thought about clothing not just as appearance, but as behavioral architecture. The dress shaped the body's possibilities. The body's possibilities shaped the social interaction. The social interaction reproduced the hierarchy. It was a closed loop, elegant in its totalizing logic, and completely invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. Here is a question I want to leave you with for a moment. We live in an era where fashion is often described as purely personal expression. Your style is yours. Your choices are individual. They reflect you, not a system. But are they? Think about the last time you got dressed for something that mattered. A job interview, a first date, a family event where the dynamics were complicated, a meeting where you needed to be taken seriously. Did you think about what you wore? Did you make choices consciously or not, based on what you wanted to communicate to specific people in that specific room? If you did, and most of us do, even if we do not frame it that way, then you are participating in exactly the same system that the ladies in waiting navigated every day of their court lives, just with lower stakes, and without the 2,000-gown wardrobe, though that does sound nice. The silent language of dress, the grammar of color and fabric and jewelry and deliberate absence ran through the royal court like an underground river, always present, not always visible, but always moving. And the women who understood it best were the ones who occupied a remarkable kind of power, a power that needed no decree, no official endorsement, no signature, just the right color at the right moment, and the wisdom to know exactly when to wear it. Which brings us to a chapter that in many ways completes the picture we've been building. Because we've talked about how ladies in waiting learned power exercised, it communicated it, through the most intimate spaces and the most visible surfaces of court life. But there is another dimension to their world that we've only touched on lightly. The emotional one, the private conversations, the nights when a queen could not sleep, the weight of grief and fear and loneliness that crowns do not protect against. And the women who are trusted, not with information, not with fashion, not with political influence, but with something rarer and more fragile than any of those things. The unguarded human heart of a queen. That is the next chapter. And it is, I think, the most quietly powerful one yet. Something I have noticed, the longer I sit with this history, the further you get from the official record, the closer you get to the truth. The official record tells you what was decided, what was declared, what was signed and sealed, and dispatched to the four corners of the known world. But the truth, the real breathing, fully human truth of what it was like to be a queen in the 16th or 17th century, that lives somewhere else entirely. It lives in the letters that were never meant to be read by strangers, in the diaries kept in cramped handwriting under candlelight, in the fragments of conversation that a lady in waiting remembered decades later and wrote down almost as an afterthought in her own memoir. And what those fragments reveal consistently across courts and centuries and cultures is something that the grand portraits and the official histories almost never show. Queens were lonely, not in the simple romantic sense, in a profound structural, almost architectural sense. They were surrounded by people every hour of every day, and almost none of those people could be trusted with the full weight of what they actually felt. Almost none, but not quite none. Let me tell you about a quality that does not appear in any official job description for ladies in waiting. It had no formal name. It was never listed among the required competences, never evaluated in any official sense. But it was, in my view, the single most important thing a lady in waiting could offer: the capacity to receive, to sit with a queen in her worst moments, and not flinch. To hear things that could not be unsaid, and carry them without faltering. To be a witness to the unraveling that happened, that had to happen, behind the closed door before the public face could be reassembled for the next morning's performance. This is not a passive skill. I want to be clear about that. The ability to hold space for someone else's pain, to be genuinely present for it, without retreating into platitudes, without trying to fix it too quickly, without making it about yourself. That is one of the hardest things a human being can do. And the ladies in waiting who did it well were in their own quiet way doing something remarkable. Maria Theresa of Austria. If you know anything about 18th century European history, you know the name. Empress of the Habsburg dominions, Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, Archduchess of Austria. She held more official titles than almost any woman in European history. She ruled an empire of roughly 20 million people for 4 decades. She reformed the legal system, reorganized the military, restructured the tax code, and gave birth to 16 children, 11 of whom survived to adulthood. One of those children was Maria Antoinette, who we will talk about in depth in a later chapter. Maria Theresa is often presented in history as the epitome of composed, capable, relentless queenship. And she was all of those things. But she was also a woman who experienced grief with an intensity that her contemporaries found almost unsettling. When her husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, died suddenly in the year 1765. They had been married for 29 years, and by most accounts, it was a genuine love match, which was not something you could take for granted in royal marriages of that era. Maria Theresa's response was total. She cut her hair. She had the walls of her apartments painted black. She wore mourning dress for the remaining 15 years of her life, not as performance, as the honest external expression of an internal state that never fully resolved. And through those 15 years of widowhood, those 15 years during which she continued to rule the empire with her customary precision and ferocity, the women of her household were her constant companions, not just practically, emotionally. There is a letter written by Maria Theresa in the years after Francis's death in which she describes what it felt like to wake each morning in a bed that was no longer shared. The letter was addressed not to a minister, not to a fellow monarch, not to any official figure. It was addressed to one of her ladies, a woman named Maria Joseph von Harrach, who had served in the imperial household for decades, and who, by the time of Francis's death, knew the Empress well enough to receive a letter like that without misunderstanding it. The letter is not dramatic. It does not contain great declarations or sweeping emotional pronouncements. It is quiet and specific and achingly human. She writes about the sound of the palace in the early morning, about the particular quality of light in the room she used to share, about the strange persistence of small habits, reaching for a hand that was no longer there. Maria Theresa, who governed 20 million people with iron competence, needed someone to tell that to. And the woman she told it to was her lady. Now, I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this story that could become sentimental very quickly, and I do not think sentimentality does it justice. The emotional support that ladies-in-waiting provided was not separate from the political world. It was woven through it inseparably. A queen who was destabilized by grief was politically vulnerable. Her enemies, and every queen had enemies, always, without exception, would look for moments of weakness and exploit them. The ladies-in-waiting who helped a queen maintain her inner equilibrium were not just being kind. They were performing a function that had genuine political consequences. A steadied queen made better decisions. A queen who had processed her grief or her fear or her anger in the private space her ladies provided, that queen could walk back into the council chamber, composed, legible, and in control of herself. The emotional labor of ladies-in-waiting was in this sense a form of governance, quiet, invisible, entirely uncredited, but real. Here is a story that I find devastating and beautiful in equal measure. Her name is Henrietta Maria. She was the daughter of Henry IV of France and Marie de Medici, and she married Charles I. England in the year 1625. By any objective measure, Henrietta Maria's life was extraordinarily difficult. She was Catholic in a Protestant country. She was French in an English court that did not entirely trust her. Her marriage, which began awkwardly, as both parties had expected to be more in control than the other, eventually became, by most accounts, a deep and genuine partnership. But the path to that partnership was rocky, public and political, in ways that left very little room for ordinary human comfort. When the English Civil War began, when Charles I found himself at war with his own parliament, his own people, his own kingdom, Henrietta Maria was by his side, and then she was not. She left England in the year 1642, ostensibly to accompany their daughter Mary to the Netherlands, in reality to raise funds and support for the royalist cause on the continent. She never saw Charles again after that departure. He was executed in January of the year 1649. She was in Paris when it happened. The women who surrounded Henrietta Maria in the years of her exile were French ladies, the English ladies who had followed her across the Channel, the women who had served her since her days as queen. Those women witnessed something that no official account fully captures. They watched a woman absorb a loss of almost incomprehensible dimensions. not just the loss of her husband, the loss of her world, her kingdom, her children's inheritance, her own identity as a reigning queen, which had been replaced overnight by the more precarious identity of an exiled widow, and they stayed. Not all of them. Exile is expensive and inconvenient, and the continental courts were not infinitely hospitable. Some of her ladies returned to England, made their peace with the new order, got on with their lives, but some stayed. The ones who stayed did so at real personal cost. They gave up the stability of home, of established social position, of the ordinary rhythms of English life. They lived in cramped apartments in the Louvre, on pensions that were often late and sometimes non-existent. They served a queen who had no kingdom, and Henrietta Maria, who was by contemporary accounts a woman of considerable pride and not always easy temperament. Henrietta Maria remembered who stayed. Years later, when the monarchy was restored in 1660 with her son Charles II on the throne, she used what remained of her influence to reward those women and their families. That is loyalty, offered across a chasm of loss and remembered. You know, there is something that history does not often acknowledge about the emotional lives of ladies in waiting. We think about what they gave to the queens they served, the companionship, the comfort, the midnight confessions. But what about the other direction? These women had their own grief, their own fears, their own losses, husbands left at home, children growing up without them, parents aging and then dying, while their daughters were at court, bound by duty to remain. And they carried all of that, their own weight and the queen's weight, simultaneously, in an environment where showing too much of your own distress was a liability. A lady in waiting who fell apart was a lady in waiting who was no longer useful, and a lady in waiting who was no longer useful was in the brutal arithmetic of the court, a lady in waiting who would be replaced. So they learned to hold both their own interior life and the one they were required to manage on behalf of someone else. I find that honestly deeply fine, that one of the most quietly heroic things I encounter in this history, not the dramatic heroism of battle or sacrifice, the daily uncelebrated heroism of showing up, of remaining functional and present, and reliable, in circumstances that would have justified a complete unraveling. Let me bring in one more figure, because she represents something slightly different and something I think is worth sitting with before we move on. Her name is Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. She served Queen Anne of Great Britain, the last Stuart monarch, as her closest companion, her groom of the stole, and for many years, by all accounts, her dearest friend. The relationship between Sarah Churchill and Queen Anne is one of the most intensely documented intimate friendships in the history of the British monarchy. They had known each other since childhood. They wrote to each other under pseudonyms and signed her letters to Sarah as Mrs. Molly. Sarah signed hers as Mrs. Freeman. The choice of names was deliberate and revealing. Molly restrained, composed, proper. Freeman direct, unfiltered, unconstrained. Sarah Churchill was by every account an extraordinary woman. Brilliant, opinionated, ferociously energetic, and almost completely incapable of the kind of careful self-management that the court usually demanded. She said what she thought. She pushed back when she disagreed. She treated the Queen in the privacy of their correspondence and their private conversations with a frankness that was in the context of the relationship between a monarch and a subject, genuinely astonishing. And for a long time, Anne loved her for it, because the freedom that Sarah represented, the ability to be spoken to honestly, to be disagreed with, to be treated as a person rather than as a symbol, that freedom was extraordinarily rare. The letters between them, which survive in remarkable quantity, show a friendship of real depth and real complexity. Anne's letters to Sarah are sometimes almost painfully eager. She wanted to be with her. She was hurt when Sarah was cold or distant. She relied on that friendship in ways that went far beyond the official duties of a court attendant. But here is the part of the story that makes it genuinely complicated. Sarah Churchill was also politically active. Her husband John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, was the greatest military commander of his age, and Sarah used her access to the Queen, used the deep, personal intimacy of their friendship to advance political causes she believed in and protect her husband's interests. Was that wrong? Was that a betrayal of the friendship? I have thought about this a lot, and I am genuinely uncertain. In one sense, using a personal relationship to advance political ends is a kind of deception. The friendship becomes instrumentalized, the emotional intimacy becomes a means to an end. But in another sense, given the world Sarah Churchill inhabited, given that there were no official channels through which a woman of her intelligence and capability could exercise political influence, was it really so different from what we all do when we use the relationships available to us to pursue the things we believe matter? The line between genuine friendship and strategic alliance has always been blurry in courts and in ordinary life, and Sarah Churchill lived right on that line for years, until she did not. The friendship ended, not quietly. It ended in a series of increasingly bitter letters, a gradual withdrawal of access, a replacement, the cousin Abigail Masham, who entered the Queen's service and proved more politically useful to a different faction. Sarah Churchill was formally dismissed from her court positions in the year 1711, and Queen Anne, who had once written to her with the desperation of someone afraid of losing their only real friend, did not say goodbye. That ending, the coldness of it, the political machinery that moved through what had been genuine human warmth, says something important about the world these women inhabited. Emotional intimacy and political calculation were never truly separate in the royal court. They coexisted in the same space, breathing the same air. The warmth was real. The calculation was also real, and neither cancelled out the other. The ladies-in-waiting who served as emotional anchors for the queens they attended were not simply being kind, and the queens who allowed themselves to be held by those women were not simply being vulnerable. They were participating in a system of mutual dependence, genuine on both sides, complicated on both sides. That is, in its own way, a portrait of human relationships, more honest than most official histories dare to be. I want to leave you with one image as we close this chapter. Not a dramatic one, not a moment of crisis or triumph or visible consequence. Just a room, late at night, the fire burning low, a queen sitting in the chair she always sits in, the one positioned where the warmth reaches her, but the drafts do not. And beside her, not in front of her, not at any official angle, just beside her, a woman sitting quietly, not performing anything, not waiting for anything, just present. The queen has been crying, or she has not. Either way, the woman beside her knows, and knowing is enough. No words necessary, no record made, no history written, just two people in a room, one of them carrying a crown, both of them carrying everything else. And now we move into territory that is harder, because we have been talking about women who stayed, women whose loyalty held, women who offered comfort and received it. But the court was also a place of betrayal, of calculation that crossed into cruelty, of alliances formed then broken, for reasons that history sometimes remembers and sometimes does not. In the next chapter, we go to the place where loyalty met its final test, where some women chose their queen and some women chose themselves, and where the difference between these choices, in some cases, was the difference between life and something else entirely. Stay with me. This next chapter is one you will not forget. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. If the person you had pledged your loyalty to, the person you'd served for years, who trusted you with her most private moments, who you had dressed and accompanied and watched over through illness and grief and triumph, if that person suddenly became a liability, what would you do? Not a hypothetical liability, a real one. The kind where your association with her could end your family's fortune, could end your freedom, could, in the most extreme circumstances, end your life. Would you stay? Or would you find a way to quietly, carefully, plausibly distance yourself before the fall came? Most people, if they are honest, would admit that this is not a simple question. And the ladies-in-waiting of the royal courts who faced this question, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a lived reality, sometimes with very little warning, gave answers that were as varied and as human as you would expect. Some stayed at enormous cost. Some turned for reasons that range from naked self-preservation to genuine conviction, and some tried to do both simultaneously, which is perhaps the most human response of all, and also the most dangerous. Tonight we walk into those choices, and I promise you, none of them are simple. The year is 1536. The place is the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn has been Queen of England for 3 years. She has given Henry VIII one surviving child, a daughter named Elizabeth, not the son the king had wanted and staked so much on. She has miscarried at least twice since then, including one pregnancy, that by some contemporary accounts ended in a way that was used as evidence against her at her trial. Now she's in the Tower charged with offences so serious that to describe them is to understand how completely the ground had shifted beneath her feet. And her ladies-in-waiting are with her, not by choice, by royal command. A group of women, specifically selected historians believe for their willingness to report what Anne said and did in her captivity, were assigned to attend her in the Tower. Think about what that means. These women had served Anne. Some of them had known her for years. They addressed her, traveled with her, attended her in the moments of her greatest triumph, the coronation procession through London in 1533, when the crowds cheered, and the city had been decorated with the letter A for Anne, and everything had seemed possible. And now they were sitting with her in a stone room in the Tower, and at least some of them were reporting what she said to the men who were building the case against her. Was that betrayal? I want to sit with that question, rather than answer it too quickly, because those women did not necessarily choose this. They were placed in service during her imprisonment, specifically because someone in power wanted eyes and ears in that room. Refusing to serve in that capacity would have required a clarity of moral purpose and a willingness to accept the consequences that in the atmosphere of Henry's court in 1536 was genuinely extraordinary to expect of anyone. The records that survived from Anne's imprisonment include fragments of conversation, things she reportedly said to her ladies in the Tower that were clearly transcribed and passed along. She spoke about the charges against her, about her innocence, about the king, about fear, about, on at least one occasion, laughing a sound that her jailers apparently noted with something between bewilderment and suspicion, as though a woman in her situation had no right to it. Those fragments reached the men conducting her trial. One of Anne's ladies during this period was a woman named Margaret Lee, and unlike some of the others, Margaret Lee appears, based on the limited record, to have been genuinely devoted to Anne, rather than serving as an informant. She wept openly at Anne's trial. She maintained the relationship with Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, after the execution. She's one of the few figures from Anne's imprisonment who comes through the record as someone who tried, within the impossible constraints of her position, to remain loyal. Her choice cost her relatively little in the end, because Anne fell so completely and so quickly that there was no sustained purge of those who'd been close to her. But the choice was made under conditions where no one could have been certain of that outcome. Now Anne Boleyn's story is the most famous, but it is not the most instructive. The story I want to spend more time on, the one that I think reveals the full complexity of loyalty and betrayal in The Lady-in-Waiting. World involves a woman you may not have heard of. Her name is Jane Dormer. Jane Dormer was born in 1538, and she came to court as a maid of honor to Mary I, the Catholic queen whom Protestant England called Bloody Mary. We have mentioned Mary's story briefly in earlier chapters, but Jane Dormer's experience within it is its own complete and extraordinary thing. Jane was, by contemporary accounts, genuinely devoted to Mary. Not politically devoted, though she was certainly Catholic and aligned with Mary's religious convictions. Personally devoted, she was one of the women present at Mary's deathbed in 1558. She held the Queen's hand. She stayed. And then almost immediately after Mary's death, Jane Dormer left England. She married the Duke of Freia, a Spanish nobleman who'd been part of Philip II's entourage, and she went to Spain, where she lived for the rest of her long life, dying in 1612 at the age of 73. Now, was that abandonment? On one level, no. Mary was already dead. There was nothing left to abandon. But on another level, Jane Dormer's departure was a statement. She was a Catholic in a country that was about to become Protestant again under Elizabeth I. She had served a queen who history was already beginning to judge harshly, and she chose not to stay and navigate the transition. Instead, she carried Mary with her into exile, into memory. Jane Dormer spent decades in Spain, giving interviews to a biographer, a man named Henry Clifford, who compiled her memories of Mary I into what became one of the most important personal accounts of that reign. Much of what historians know about Mary's private character, her humor, her warmth, her genuine religious conviction, as opposed to the caricature of fanaticism, comes through Jane Dormer's testimony. She preserved her queen not in a portrait, not in an official document, in memory spoken aloud carefully across the years. That is a form of loyalty that reaches past death, and I find it honestly more moving than almost anything in this history. But let me turn now to the harder side of this, because we have been circling around betrayal without quite landing in it. Let me land in it now. The court of Henry VIII is understandably where historians find the most dramatic examples of ladies-in-waiting caught between loyalty and survival. Henry had 6 wives. 3 of his wives, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and Catherine Howard, were themselves former ladies-in-waiting, which means that as queens, they had attendants who had watched them rise from that same position, who knew their histories, who knew things that in the wrong circumstances could be devastating. Catherine Howard is the case I want to examine. Catherine came to Henry's court as a lady-in-waiting to Anne Cleves, Henry's 4th wife. The marriage that lasted approximately 6 months before Henry decided he had been misled about Anne's appearance and sought an annulment. Catherine was 16 or 17 when she entered court. She was from the Howard family, powerful Catholic, politically ambitious, and she'd grown up in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. That upbringing is important, because the Dowager Duchess's household was by the accounts of those who lived in it a place of considerable looseness in terms of supervision. Young men and women had access to one another in ways that more strictly governed households would never have permitted. Catherine had formed attachments, at least 2, that we know of before she ever came to court. When she became queen, Henry married her in the summer of 1540. Those earlier relationships became the most dangerous thing in the world, not because of what they were in themselves, but because of what they could be made to mean by people who wanted to destroy her. And Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, the women who attended her as queen, were divided fatally between those who knew about her past and those who did not. One of the women who knew was a former companion from the Dowager Duchess's household named Joan Bulmer. Joan wrote to Catherine after her marriage, reminding her of their past acquaintance and effectively asking for a position at court. What was Catherine supposed to do? Refuse and risk Joan speaking about what she knew? Accept and bring someone into her household who held information that could be weaponized? She accepted. Joan Bulmer became part of Catherine Howard's household, and when the investigation into Catherine's past began, when Henry's advisors started gathering testimony about her conduct before her marriage, Joan Bulmer's testimony was among those collected. Catherine Howard was executed in February of the year 1542. She was probably no older than 19 or 20. Joan Bulmer was imprisoned in the Tower. She was eventually released. She survived. I want to be careful about how I frame this, because Joan Bulmer's choices writing to Catherine, accepting the position, eventually providing testimony. Those choices exist in a moral space that is genuinely complicated. Was she a traitor? She certainly participated in a process that ended Catherine's life. Was she a survivor? Also, yes. She was a woman of no particular power or protection, caught in the machinery of a court, where the wrong answer to a royal investigator's question could end very badly. The history of ladies-in-waiting is full of women like Joan Bulmer. Not villains, not heroes, people trying to navigate impossible circumstances with the limited tools available to them. And I think that complexity, that moral ambiguity that resists easy judgment, is one of the most important things this history has to teach us. We like our historical narratives clean. We like to know who the good people were and who the bad people were. We like loyalty to be absolute and betrayal to be obvious. The real courts were not like that. The real women were not like that. They were people as complicated, as frightened, as capable of both courage and compromise as any people who have ever lived. Now, let me tell you about a case where the choice was made differently, where the cost of loyalty was paid in full, and where the woman who paid it never seems to have doubted that it was worth paying. Her name is Mary Seton. She was one of the famous four Marys, the four Scottish noble women, all named Mary, who were sent to France with Mary, Queen of Scots, when the young queen was 6 years old. Mary Fleming, Mary Beaton, Mary Livingston, and Mary Seton. They grew up together. They were educated together at the French court. They returned to Scotland together. They served Mary, Queen of Scots, through the disastrous years of her Scottish reign, the murder of her secretary Rizzio, the suspicious death of her husband Darnley, the forced abdication, the imprisonment, the escape. One by one, as the years of Mary's imprisonment in England stretched from months into years, the other Marys returned to their own lives. Mary Fleming married. Mary Livingston married. Mary Beaton married. Mary Seton stayed for years in the various houses where Mary Queen of Scots was held under increasingly strict confinement. Carlisle, Bolton, Tutbury, Sheffield, Chartley, Fotheringhay. Mary Seton was there. She dressed the Queen's hair. This was not a small thing. Mary Queen of Scots had, according to all contemporary accounts, exceptionally beautiful hair, and the styling of it was one of the few pleasures and acts of personal dignity available to a woman whose movements, correspondence, and activities were all controlled. Mary Seton was renowned, even at the French court, for her skill in this particular art. She made the Queen look like a queen in circumstances specifically designed to reduce her to a prisoner that mattered not as vanity, as resistance, as the daily gentle insistence that dignity does not require freedom to exist. Mary Seton finally had to leave. Her own health had deteriorated after years of the difficult conditions of Mary's imprisonment, and she retired to a convent in France in the 1580s. She outlived her queen. She died around the year 1615. She never married. She gave her most productive decades to a woman who, by any rational calculation, had very little left to give in return. And I have to believe she knew that. I have to believe she made a considered choice. That loyalty for her was not something you calculated the return on. It was simply who she decided to be. So here we have the full spectrum, from the women in the Tower who reported Anne Boleyn's words, to her enemies, to Joan Bulmer, caught between obligation and survival, to Jane Dormer carrying her Queen's memory across an ocean into old age, to Mary Seton staying when everyone else had gone. What do we do with all of this? I think, and this is genuinely my own view, not received historical wisdom, I think we resist the temptation to sort these women into heroes and villains, because the court was a system that placed people under pressures most of us will never experience. That asked for loyalty in conditions where loyalty was genuinely dangerous. That rewarded betrayal sometimes and punished it other times, with no reliable logic that could guide behavior in advance. In that system, the women who remained fully loyal, who paid the full cost, were remarkable. Not because loyalty is easy, because in those specific circumstances, it was extraordinarily hard. And the women who did not, who made the calculation differently, or who were ground up by Demerton machinery too large and too indifferent to care about their individual moral choices, those women deserve our understanding, if not always our admiration. What comes next in our story is both darker and more beautiful than what we have covered so far, because now we leave the courts of England and France and Spain, the familiar geography of European royal power, and travel somewhere else entirely. We go to Versailles, not as tourists, not as admirers of the architecture, but as people trying to understand what it actually felt like to live inside the most elaborate, most suffocating, most breathtakingly golden cage ever constructed for human habitation. The Palace of Versailles under Louis XIV was not just a royal residence. It was a system, a machine, for producing and maintaining power through the management of human beings at every level. And the ladies-in-waiting who lived inside it, who competed ferociously for positions within it, who suffered and schemed and occasionally thrived within its gilded walls. Their story is one of the most extraordinary chapters in this entire history. That chapter begins right now. Close your eyes for just a moment and try to picture this. You wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Not in your own home, not in a place you chose, in a palace so large that it takes 20 minutes to walk from one end to the other. A palace with over 2,000 rooms, roughly 15,000 people living within its grounds, and a social hierarchy so precisely calibrated that the exact angle at which you bow to whom and at what distance is a matter of official protocol. Every day begins the same way. Every day is a performance, and the audience never leaves. This is Versailles, not the Versailles of tourists and postcard photographs and afternoon light streaming through the hall of mirrors. The Versailles that was actually lived in, the one that smelled of unwashed bodies and expensive perfume in equal measure because there were remarkably few bathrooms for 15,000 people. The one where the competition for social position was so relentless, so total, so woven into every interaction that contemporaries described living there as permanently exhausting. And at the center of this machine, this brilliant, suffocating, incomparably beautiful machine was a system of ladies-in-waiting, more elaborate than anywhere else in Europe. To understand what Versailles meant for ladies-in-waiting, you first have to understand what Louis XIV was actually trying to do when he built it. Because Versailles was not primarily a residence, it was a political instrument. Louis became King of France at the age of 4, in the year 1643. His early reign was marked by a period of civil unrest called the Fronde, a series of revolts by French nobles who resented the centralization of power in the monarchy and its ministers. The young Louis was forced to flee Paris on at least one occasion. He remembered it for the rest of his life. He remembered it when he came into his full power in 1661, following the death of his chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. Louis made a decision that was in its way one of the most strategically brilliant moves in the history of European governance. He moved the court to Versailles. He brought the nobility with him, and then he made Versailles the only place in France where real power and prestige could be obtained. Think about what that means in practice. If you were a great noble family, a duke, a marquis, a family with generations of regional influence and military tradition, you now had two choices. You could stay on your estates in the provinces, maintaining whatever local power remained to you. Or you could come to Versailles, live in apartments that were frequently small and uncomfortable, despite the palace's grandeur, spend enormous sums on clothing and entertainment, and the very endless social theater of court life, and compete every single day for proximity to the king. Most of them came to Versailles because proximity to Louis was everything. A word from the king, a glance of recognition, an invitation to walk with him in the gardens or watch him dine or stand in the correct room during the elaborate daily ritual of his rising and retiring. These were not social pleasures. They were the currency of power. And what applied to the men of the court applied equally in the Queen's household to the ladies. The hierarchy of ladies-in-waiting at Versailles was a structure of extraordinary complexity. At the very top sat the superintendent de la maison the superintendent of the Queen's household. This was a position of such prestige that it was typically held by a duchess. She oversaw everything, managed the budget of the Queen's household, coordinated the schedule, and maintained with iron precision the hierarchy of everyone below her. Below her came the dame d'honneur, the lady of honor, who served as the Queen's most intimate daily companion and managed the practical details of her personal life. Then the ladies of the palace, the dames d'Opale, typically 12 in number, drawn exclusively from the highest ranks of the French nobility. These women served in rotation, spending 3 months at Versailles, and then returning home for a period before resuming their service. And below them, the various other attendants, the women of the bedchamber, the readers, the musicians, the dressers, each with their own precise rank, their own specific duties, and their own place in the unending social drama. Now, here is the thing that I find both fascinating and slightly dizzying. Every single one of these positions was an object of intense competition. Not because the work was pleasant, it frequently was not. Not because the pay was generous, it frequently was not that either. But because each position represented a defined, official, publicly recognized level of access to the Queen, and access to the Queen meant access to her influence over the King. And access to the King's influence was the closest thing to a guarantee of political survival that existed in Louis XIV's France. So noble families, families with ancient names and proud histories and elaborate coats of arms, competed, maneuvered, spent fortunes, and occasionally ruined themselves trying to secure or maintain positions in the Queen's household. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. The great families of France, who had once been a genuine counterweight to royal power, now spent their energy and resources competing for the privilege of holding the Queen's candle during her evening prayers. Louis, who understood this perfectly, found it quietly satisfying. I want to introduce you to a woman who lived this system from the inside, observed it with extraordinary clarity, and left behind a record of it that historians still return to again and again. Her name is Charlotte Elizabeth of Bavaria. She's better known by the title she held at Versailles, Madame Palatine, or simply Lisa. She was the second wife of Louis XIV's brother, Philippe I, Duke of Orléans, which made her the sister-in-law of the king, and one of the most senior women at Versailles. Lieselotte was German. She had been sent to France in the year 1671, at the age of 19, to marry Philippe, a marriage that was diplomatically useful and personally challenging since Philippe was not primarily interested in women, and the marriage, while outwardly civil, was emotionally lonely. Or her. What Lieselotte did in her loneliness and her sharpness and her considerable intelligence was write letters, thousands of them, over decades to her relatives in Germany, to friends across Europe, to anyone who would receive and keep them. These letters, many of which survive, are one of the most vivid, unguarded, often very funny accounts of life at Versailles that exists anywhere. Lieselotte had no patience for pretension. She had no particular investment in making Versailles look better than it was, and she had the social position to observe everything without being entirely consumed by the game herself. She wrote about the competition between ladies-in-waiting with the tone of someone describing a particularly intense sporting event. She described women arriving at court in new gowns, clearly designed to catch specific attention. She described the elaborate dances of approach and withdrawal through which ladies signal their current alliances and ambitions. She described with barely concealed amusement the desperate social calculations that governed something as simple as who stood next to whom, clears, at the evening entertainments. And she wrote with considerable frequency about the exhaustion of it all. One must always be on stage here. She wrote in one letter, in a line that has been quoted by historians ever since. There is never a moment when one can simply be oneself. She was describing her own experience, but she was also, I think, describing the experience of every lady-in-waiting who moved through those corridors. Now, let me take you to a specific drama that unfolded within the Versailles system, because abstract descriptions of hierarchy and competition only go so far. The real texture of what this was like emerges in the particular stories. In the year 1682, the year Louis officially moved his court permanently to Versailles, the position of Surintendant de la became vacant. The Queen was Marie-Thérèse of Austria, Louis's Spanish-born wife, who is one of the more quietly poignant figures in this entire story. Maritz was genuinely devoted to her husband. She accepted his various relationships with other women with a public composure that must have required enormous personal discipline. She was pious, kind, and by most accounts, not intellectually brilliant, which at a court where wit and sophistication were social weapons, made her somewhat vulnerable to condescension from people who were supposed to be serving her. The competition for the position of Surintendante was, by contemporary accounts, ferocious. Multiple noble families lobbied the king directly. Alliances were formed and reformed. Promises were made and broken. The lobbying extended beyond Versailles itself, reaching into the diplomatic correspondence of foreign courts, who had their own interest in who would control the most senior position in the French queen's household. When Louis finally made his choice, the Duchess of Richelieu, the women who had hoped for the position, and their families, spent months recalibrating their positions and strategies accordingly. Not because the position itself would have made the Duchess of Richelieu powerful in any direct sense, but because it confirmed her family's place in the inner orbit. And in the Versailles system, inner orbit was everything. Here is something that surprises people when they first learn it. Despite the extraordinary wealth on display at Versailles, the gold, the marble, the paintings, the tapestries, the fountains that required the equivalent of modern hydraulic engineering to operate, many of the ladies-in-waiting at the French court were not particularly comfortable. Their apartments were often small, cold in winter, and located in the less desirable parts of the jour. In fact, the heating at Versailles was notoriously inadequate. There are accounts of wine freezing on the table during formal winter dinners. The sanitation was by any reasonable standard appalling for a building of such grandeur, and the financial demands of court life were relentless. You were expected to dress at the level appropriate to your position in the occasion. You were expected to entertain, to give gifts, to participate in the social economy of the court, with a consistency that required money you may or may not actually have had. Some noble families went deeply into debt maintaining their position at Versailles. Some borrowed against estates they ultimately could not recover. The glittering surface of the court concealed in many cases a financial reality that was considerably grimmer. And yet they stayed, because leaving, truly leaving, removing yourself from Versailles, and returning to your provincial estates, was not just a personal choice. It was a public statement. It meant you were no longer a player, that your family had been reduced to the kind of importance that could be exercised from a distance. In Louis XIV's France that were a form of political death, so they stayed. They put on the gowns. They maintained the performance. They competed and maneuvered, and exhausted themselves in service of a hierarchy that served the king far more than it served any of them. And some of them, the sharpest, the most perceptive, the ones with real ability and real ambition, found ways to make the system work for them. Anyway, let me tell you about one of those women. Her name is Anne de Rohan-Chaboul, Princess of Sub. She entered the Versailles system as a lady-in-waiting to the Queen in the 1670s, from one of the most ancient noble families in France. Beautiful, intelligent, and possessed of a social agility that contemporaries noted with genuine admiration and occasional weariness, the Princess of Sub navigated the court with a precision that went beyond mere social skill. She understood with unusual clarity how the various layers of influence at Versailles intersected. She maintained relationships across factional lines in a court where most people committed entirely to one side or the other. She cultivated connections with figures close to the king while remaining genuinely useful to the Queen. Her family's fortunes improved markedly during her years of service. Appointments, properties, military positions for her relatives. The flow of royal favor toward the Rohan-Chaboul family during the years of her court service was not accidental. She's not a figure who appears prominently in most histories of Versailles. She did not hold the most senior position. She was not involved in any of the dramatic public scandals that tended to attract historical attention. She was simply very, very good at the game. She played it with intelligence and discretion and extraordinary consistency. And her family benefited from it for generations that I would argue is as impressive as anything the more famous figures of Versailles accomplished. Perhaps more so, because it required sustaining a level of performance and awareness over decades, without the dramatic peaks and valleys that tend to make people memorable to history. There is something about Versailles specifically that I want to name directly before we move on, because it represents a particular evolution in the story we've been following. In the Tudor court, in the courts of Spain and the smaller European kingdoms, the ladies-in-waiting system had developed organically, shaped by tradition and personal relationships, and the specific characters of the women involved. Versailles was something different. It was a designed system, deliberately engineered to produce specific outcomes. Louis XIV understood with a clarity that makes him both admirable and slightly alarming that human beings will compete for status if status is made scarce and visible and tied to proximity, to power. He made all of those things true at Versailles, and then he sat back and watched the competition unfold. The ladies-in-waiting were not incidental to this system. They were structural components of it. Their competition, their maneuvering, their investment of enormous resources in maintaining their positions, all of that served Louis. It kept the nobility occupied. It directed their energy inward toward the court, away from the kinds of independent power, bases that had threatened the monarchy during the Fronde. The golden cage was the point, not an unintended consequence. The point, and the women inside it, in all their complexity, their ambition, their occasional brilliance, their frequent exhaustion, were both participants in the system, and in a very real sense, the material through which the system operated. Versailles remained the center of the French court until October of 1789, when the courageous revolutionary crowd marched from Paris to the palace, and the royal family was forcibly returned to the capital. The system that Louis had spent decades engineering ended not with a diplomatic transition, but with armed citizens at the gate. The ladies-in-waiting who were present on that night made choices, as they always had, about where their loyalty lay and what they were willing to risk for it. Some fled, some stayed. Some tried to protect the queen they served. Some disappeared into the general upheaval and were never heard from again. But that story belongs to a later chapter, because before we get to the French Revolution and what it meant for the women who served inside Versailles, there is a world we've not yet visited. A world where the ladies-in-waiting system took forms that were in some ways even more sophisticated and even more consequential than anything we have seen in Europe so far. We're going east, to the Ottoman Palace complex in Constantinople, to the imperial courts of Japan, to the Forbidden City of China. And what we find there, I promise you, will change the way you think about everything we've already covered. That chapter is next. There is a moment in any long journey when you step off the familiar path and realize the landscape has changed completely around you. The language is different, the architecture is different, the rules, the rituals, the way power moves through space and silence, all of it different. And yet, when you look closely, when you sit with the details long enough, you start to see the same shape underneath, the same human hunger for proximity to power, the same extraordinary women finding ways to exercise influence in systems that officially offered them almost none, the same quiet, patient, devastating intelligence operating in spaces that official history barely bothered to name. We have spent the last several chapters inside European palaces. Tonight we go somewhere else. Three somewhere actually. 3 civilizations, 3 court systems, 3 versions of the same fundamental story. And I want to start with the one that in my view contains the single most remarkable individual we have encountered in this entire journey. We are going to Japan first. The Han period in Japan, spanning roughly from the year 794 to 1185, is one of the most fascinating chapters in the cultural history of any civilization on Earth. It was centered on the imperial capital of Kyoto, then called Han Kyo, and it was a period in which the imperial court developed a culture of extraordinary refinement, poetry, music, painting, calligraphy, the careful cultivation of aesthetic experience as a form of both personal expression and social currency. The women of the Han court occupied a position that was in formal terms entirely subordinate to men. Women could not hold official government positions. They could not participate in the formal ceremonies of state. They were expected to remain largely within the inner quarters of the palace, screened from direct public view by layers of curtain and architectural convention. And yet, and this is the part that keeps stopping me, the Han period produced some of the greatest literary works in Japanese history, and the overwhelming majority of them were written by women. Not because men lacked talent or education, but because the formal written language used in official male context, classical Chinese, was considered inappropriate for the kind of personal, emotional, observational literature that the period valued. Women wrote in the vernacular Japanese script, kana, which men considered beneath official use, and in doing so, they created a literature of extraordinary power and lasting influence. The irony is almost too perfect. The women were given the lesser language, and they made it immortal. Now within this world, the court ladies who served the imperial household were called Niobo, and their role was in structural terms recognizable to us by now. They served the empress and the imperial concubines. They managed the domestic life of the inner palace. They were selected from noble families, educated in the arts, considered essential for court life. But there was a dimension to their function that went beyond anything we have seen in the dual European courts. The Niobo were the primary cultural producers of hei in Japan, not secondary contributors, not occasional participants, the primary producers. The poetry competitions that were a central feature of Han court culture, dominated by women. The diaries that give us our most vivid picture of what Han court life actually felt and smelled, and sounded like written by women. The prose narratives that explored the inner lives of court figures with a psychological complexity that was genuinely unprecedented in world literature, written by a court lady named Murasaki Shikibu. I mentioned her briefly in our first chapter. Now she deserves her full moment. Murasaki Shikibu was born somewhere around the year 973. We do not know her real name. Murasaki Shikibu is a court name, Murasaki being a character from her own writing, Shikibu being a reference to her father's official position. This is itself a small but telling detail. Even the woman who produced what many scholars consider the world's first novel is known to history primarily through references to other people. She came from the Fujiwara clan, a family of considerable administrative importance in Han, Japan, and she served as a lady-in-waiting to the Empress Shashi, consort of Emperor Icho, beginning around the year 100. She was, by her own account, in her diary, initially deeply uncomfortable at court. She found the atmosphere competitive, the social performance exhausting, and the constant observation of her behavior by other ladies genuinely stressful. She wrote about hiding her learning, deliberately concealing how much she knew of classical Chinese literature, because she'd observed that women who displayed too much formal knowledge were viewed with suspicion by the men at court. That detail strikes me as so contemporary, it is almost startling. A woman in an 11th century Japan concealing her intellectual capabilities to avoid making men uncomfortable, and yet in this environment she found entirely hostile to authentic expression. Murasaki Shikibu had already written, or was in the process of writing, the tale of Genji. The full title in Japanese is Genji Monogatari. It is a narrative of roughly 1,000 pages in modern editions. It follows the life of the son of a Japanese emperor known as the Shining Genji across decades of court life, love, grief, political maneuvering, and aging. What makes it extraordinary? What makes it genuinely unlike anything written before it, anywhere in the world, is its psychological interiority. Murasaki Shikibu was not interested primarily in events. She was interested in how events felt, how they were experienced differently by different people, how the same moment could carry entirely different meaning depending on who was living it and what they carried into it. That is a novelistic sensibility, and it emerged not despite the constraints of her position as a court lady, but partly because of them. Because what does a lady-in-waiting do every day for years? She watches. She observes people who are performing constantly and tries to understand what is real underneath the performance. She develops an acute sensitivity to the gap between what is said and what is meant, between public face and private reality. Murasaki Shikibu turned that trained sensitivity into literature that is still being read, studied, translated, and loved more than 1,000 years later. If that does not stop you cold for a moment, I do not know what will. Let me shift continents now and take you to Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and into the Topkapi Palace complex. Because the Ottoman imperial harem is one of the most systematically misrepresented institutions in world history. The word her comes from the Arabic word for sanctuary, or forbidden space, and what it actually referred to in its Ottoman imperial form was the private residential quarters of the Sultan and his family. Not a pleasure garden staffed entirely for romantic purposes, a household, a domestic and political institution of enormous complexity, governed by its own hierarchy, its own rules, its own sophisticated system of education and advancement. The women who lived within it were not all the Sultan's companions. The vast majority were servants, officials, administrators, and the female relatives of the Sultan himself. The whole structure was presided over by the Vali Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who held a position of real and documented power within the Ottoman system. And the women who served within this structure, who attended the Vali Sultan and the Haseki, the Sultan's favored companion, occupied roles that were in their essential dynamics, recognizable to everything we've been discussing. They gathered information. They managed relationships. They served as intermediaries between the world within the haram and the world of official Ottoman governance outside it. And the most capable among them advanced through demonstrated competence and cultivated trust to positions of genuine influence. I want to tell you about a woman who entered the Ottoman harem as a slave girl, probably from somewhere in the Caucasus region, probably around the age of 12 or 13, and who became, through a combination of intelligence, political acumen, and extraordinary personal capability, one of the most powerful women in the history of the Ottoman Empire. Her name before she came to the palace, we do not know. Within the haram she was given the name Nurbanu, meaning radiant one, or pure light. She eventually rose to become the Hassi of Sultan Selim II, and after his death in 1574, the Valid and Sultan during the reign of her son Murad III. In that role as Valid Sultan from 1574 to 1583, Nurbanu Sultan exercised influence over Ottoman foreign policy that was remarkable enough to attract the attention of European ambassadors stationed in Constantinople. She corresponded directly with Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Regent of France, whose flying squadron we discussed in an earlier chapter. The two women, separated by culture, religion, language, and geography, recognized in each other something they both understood. The letters between them survive. They are models of diplomatic courtesy, layered over what are clearly substantive political communications. Two women, operating from positions that had no official formal authority, conducting foreign policy. The Venetian ambassadors stationed in Constantinople wrote detailed reports back to Venice about Nurbanu Sultan's political activities. One ambassador described her as the most important person in the Ottoman government during this period. Not the Sultan, not the Grand Vizier, but the Valid Sultan operating through the women of her household and her influence over her son. That is not a footnote. That is a primary historical source confirming that a woman who entered the Ottoman system as a slave child became, through the specific dynamics of a court ladies-in-waiting structure, one of the most consequential political figures of 16th century Europe and Asia combined. Now let me ask you something. Does any part of this surprise you? I ask genuinely, because I think most of us, if we are honest, were educated in a version of history that placed women at the margins of power in the pre-modern world, in the background, in the supportive roles, present but not consequential. And what this history keeps revealing over and over in culture after culture, century after century, is that this picture is not just incomplete, it is almost the inverse of the truth. Women were not marginal to power in these systems. They were operating at its very center, in the spaces where power was most intimate, most personal, most unguarded. The fact that they did so without official titles, without the formal designations that official history tends to track, made them harder to see. It did not make them less real. Let me take you finally to China, to the Forbidden City in Beijing, built in the early 15th century during the reign of the Yongle Emperor of the Ming dynasty. The palace complex covered roughly 180 acres. It contained approximately 900 buildings, and within it, the system of imperial court ladies, called gongnu in Chinese meaning palace. Women was among the most systematically organized in any court in the world. The gong were selected through a formal recruitment process that drew on families across the Freemasons. Young women of appropriate age and background were presented to imperial officials for assessment, and those selected were brought to the Forbidden City, where they entered a system of training and hierarchical advancement that could, in theory, last an entire lifetime. Many of them never left. They entered as teenagers and grew old within the palace walls, their entire social world defined by the hierarchy of the imperial household. The education they received was formal and demanding. They learned to read and write, unusual for women of their social background in this period. They were trained in music, in the preparation of medicinal remedies, in the management of correspondence, in the specific protocols governing every aspect of imperial daily life. And at the top of this structure, the women who reached the highest positions exercised influence over the emperor's household that could translate directly into political consequence. There is a figure from the late Ming dynasty named Lady K, also called the wet nurse of the Tiangi emperor, who reigned from 1620 to 1627. Lady K had served the emperor since his infancy. She was not an official court lady in the formal hierarchical sense, but her relationship with the emperor, founded in the most intimate dependence imaginable, that of an infant on the woman who feeds him, gave her access and influence that terrified court officials. Contemporary records show that Lady K, together with a eunuch official named Wei Zhongsan, effectively controlled access to the Tiangi emperor during significant portions of his reign. The emperor, described by contemporaries as more interested in carpentry than in governance, relied on the people closest to him to manage the world he found overwhelming, and the woman who was physically closest, who'd been closest since the beginning of his life, used that proximity with a directness that official histories of the period found almost scandalous to record. The situation ended badly. It usually did when court influence became too visible and too powerful. Lady Qi died in 1627. The emperor died the same year. But the pattern she represents of intimate domestic relationship converted into political leverage is one that runs through every court system we've examined tonight. From Han Japan to Constantinople to the Forbidden City, different languages, different rituals, different architectures of power, the same fundamental human dynamic. Here is what I take from these three stories, set side by side with everything we have seen in Crest. Power is not a location. It is not fixed in any one room, any one title, any one official designation. Power is relational. It flows through the connections between people, through trust, through information, through the accumulated weight of daily presence. And in every court civilization that has ever existed across every culture, every continent, every century, there were women who understood this instinctively, who found the spaces where power flowed and positioned themselves within those spaces, who built from the materials available to them, which were often very different from the materials available to men, forms of influence that shape the world in ways we are still slowly learning to fully see. Murasaki Shikibu, looking at the imperial court and seeing not pageantry, but the complete inner landscape of human experience. Nurbanu Sultan, corresponding with the Queen Regent of France, while managing a palace household and the foreign policy of an empire simultaneously. The Gong knew of the Forbidden City, educated and organized and present at the center of a civilization that officially recognized no formal political role for women at all. They were all doing the same thing in different costumes, in different languages, but the same fundamental thing: watching, understanding, acting carefully, precisely, in the ways available to them, and leaving behind, for those of us who look closely enough, a history that is richer and stranger and more human than the official version ever quite managed to capture. We are nearing the final chapters of this journey now, and the stories ahead bring us closer to the present, to the courts we recognize, to the women whose names appear in photographs rather than illuminated manuscripts. In the next chapter, we cross into the 19th and early 20th centuries. We meet the ladies-in-waiting of Queen Victoria, one of the longest-serving most complex royal households in British history. We follow the thread forward to the 20th century, to the quiet, devoted women who stood beside Queen Elizabeth II through 7 decades of her reign. And we encounter unexpectedly a dimension of this story that is both deeply modern and somehow the oldest part of all. That chapter begins in just a moment. Somewhere between the 16th century and the 20th, something shifted. Not suddenly, not with any single announcement or proclamation, but gradually, the way seasons change, almost imperceptible day by day, unmistakable when you step back far enough. The world that had produced the Tudor bedchamber women, the flying squadron of Catherine de' Medici, the carefully stratified hierarchy of Versailles, that world was dismantling itself slowly at first. Then, with gathering speed, revolutions, both political and industrial, the collapse of absolute monarchies, the rise of constitutions, parliaments, newspapers, when a public discourse that was increasingly impatient with the old aristocratic certainties. By the time Queen Victoria came to the British throne in 1837, at the age of 18, barely a year past the bedchamber crisis we explored much earlier, the institution of ladies-in-waiting was already beginning its long, complex negotiation with modernity. And what happened to it over the next century and a half is in its own way just as fascinating as everything that came before. Victoria's court is one of the most documented royal households in history, not just in official records, though those exist in abundance, but in diaries, letters, memoirs, and eventually in the testimonies of people who lived and remembered it well into the 20th century. And what those documents reveal is a court that was in important ways different from everything that preceded it, and yet recognizably continuous with traditions that stretched back centuries. The ladies-in-waiting still existed, the hierarchy was still real, the mistress of the robes, the ladies of the bedchamber, the women of the bedchamber, the maids of honor, all still in place. But the political landscape they operated in had changed fundamentally. Victoria was not a queen with unlimited personal power. She was a constitutional monarch. Her influence over actual governance was real. Historians have spent decades debating exactly how real, but it was exercised through different channels and with different constraints than anything a Tudor or Stuart queen would have recognized. And the women who served her reflected this. They were still noble women, still selected with attention to family connection and social standing. But the raw political stakes of serving in the Queen's household, the sense that a woman's position at court could directly determine the fate of nations, had moderated considerably. What had not moderated was the personal dimension, because Victoria herself was a woman of fierce personal attachments, and the history of her relationships with the women who served her most closely is one of the most psychologically interesting chapters in the entire story of this institution. Let me introduce you to someone who has been described by various historians over the years as the most controversial royal servant of the Victorian era. Her name is John Brown. Wait, I know that is not a woman, but bear with me for a moment, because the story of John Brown and Queen Victoria and the reaction it provoked in the ladies-in-waiting who served the Queen during that period illuminates something essential about how the institution was evolving in this era. John Brown was a Scottish servant, a gillie specifically meaning an outdoor attendant, who helped with horses and hunting on the Scottish estates. He came into closer royal service after the death of Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, in 1861. Victoria's grief after Albert's death was total and prolonged in a way that concerned everyone around her. She withdrew from public life for years. She struggled to perform even the basic ceremonial functions that constitutional monarchy required. And John Brown, plain-spoken, physically vigorous, refreshingly unimpressed by anyone's aristocratic pretensions, became her most constant companion. He spoke to her bluntly. He called her simply woman when he thought she was being unreasonable, which reportedly delighted her. He organized her daily life with a practical competence that her more socially elevated attendants sometimes lacked, and he was genuinely devoted to her, not politically, not strategically, but with the simple, uncomplicated loyalty of a person who decided that his purpose was to look after one specific, human being. The ladies-in-waiting hated him. That is not an exaggeration. The documents from this period, the diaries, the private letters, show a sustained campaign of resentment from members of Victoria's household toward John Brown that lasted until his death in 1883. And why not? Because he was incompetent, not because he treated them badly, though he was certainly not differential, because he had displaced them. The function they were supposed to perform, companionship, emotional support, daily presence, was being performed by someone outside the established hierarchy, someone who had not come through the system, someone who had not paid the social dues, made the family alliances, cultivated the court connections that the ladies-in-waiting had invested so much in. And Victoria, who cared almost nothing for the social discomfort of her court, when her own preferences were concerned, did not particularly care. She kept Brown. She grieved genuinely when he died. She reportedly requested that certain items associated with him be placed in her coffin when she died, a request that was quietly honored. The ladies-in-waiting, who had spent their careers managing Victoria's public and private life, watched all of this from a complicated angle. It was, I think, the first really clear signal that the institution was changing, that the personal dimension of royal service could no longer be reliably confined to the official categories. But let me turn now to something more directly within the institution itself, because there is a figure from Victoria's court whose story I find genuinely remarkable and who deserves to be better known. Her name is Marie Mallet. She served as a maid of honor and later a woman of the bedchamber to Queen Victoria from the 1880s until the Queen's death in 1901. And during those years, she wrote letters, hundreds of them, to her husband, Bernard Mallet, who was frequently away on his own professional business. Those letters, published decades later as a collection, are one of the most vivid, warm, and candid accounts of what it was actually like to serve Victoria at close range. Marie Mallet was not a political figure. She was not trying to influence policy or advance a family agenda. She was a genuinely thoughtful woman who found herself in an extraordinary position, and to describe it honestly. She wrote about the physical demands of the role, the long hours, the constant travel between royal residences, the specific challenge of maintaining cheerful attentiveness when you were exhausted and the Queen was in one of her difficult moods. She wrote about Victoria's humor, which was real, and which surprised people who expected the official portrait of solemn dignity. She wrote about Victoria's occasional unreasonableness, with an affectionate frankness that suggests genuine fondness beneath the professional frustration. And she wrote repeatedly about the strange duality of the position, the way that serving a queen required you to be simultaneously fully present and carefully effaced, to notice everything and comment on almost nothing, to be warm without being familiar, attentive without being intrusive, honest without being undiplomatic. "It is an art," she wrote in one letter, "that I'm not entirely sure can be taught." Reading her letters, I find myself thinking that she had understood something essential about this institution, that more ambitious or more politically motivated court ladies sometimes missed. The art was not in the strategy. It was in the presence, in showing up reliably and humanly for another person who needed to be witnessed. Victoria died in January of 1901, and with her death, the Victorian court ended. What came next under Edward III, then George V, then the abbreviated reign of Edward VII, then George V, VI, and finally the 60-year-long reign of Elizabeth II, was a gradual but unmistakable modernization of everything the institution had been. The formal hierarchy simplified. The political dimensions became more muted. The emphasis shifted increasingly toward the personal, toward the practical and social support functions that had always been present, but that now, stripped of the more overtly political elements, became the primary purpose of the role. And then came Elizabeth II. I want to be careful here, because Elizabeth II's reign is recent enough that the people who served her are either still living or only recently gone. The documentary record is still incomplete. The full story has not yet been written, but what we know is extraordinary enough. Elizabeth II came to the throne in 1952 at the age of 25. She died in September of 2022, at the age of 96. 70 years on the throne. 70 years during which the world around the monarchy changed almost beyond recognition, while the monarchy itself navigated those changes with varying degrees of grace and difficulty. And through all of it, through the entire arc of that extraordinary reign, her ladies-in-waiting were there, some of them for decades, some of them remarkably, for almost the entire span of the reign itself. The woman who served as her longest-serving Lady of the Bedchamber, Lady Mary Morrison, was appointed in 1960 and served for more than 50 years. More than 50 years of being present, reliable, discreet, and useful to the same woman. That is not a career. That is a life given in service. And the remarkable thing, or perhaps not so remarkable given everything we have learned tonight, is that by all accounts it was freely chosen, maintained by genuine loyalty, and by many accounts genuine affection. Let me tell you something about what Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting actually did in the modern load. Context, because I think it will both surprise you and feel somehow deeply familiar. In official settings, state visits, garden parties, investitures, public engagements, a lady-in-waiting managed the practical logistics of the Queen's movements. She received bouquets presented to the Queen and carried them. She managed the flow of people approaching the Queen during walkabouts, ensuring that conversations moved forward at a pace that allowed as many people as possible to be met. She handled any items given to the Queen by members of the public. She was in these moments a kind of human buffer, absorbing the organizational complexity of public royal life, so that the Queen herself could be fully present in every interaction. That is when you strip away the specific historical context, exactly what ladies-in-waiting had always done. They absorbed complexity so that a queen could maintain her composure and her focus. The content had changed, the function had not, but there was a private dimension too. And this is the part that I find most continuous with everything we have explored. Elizabeth II was by all accounts a private person, not cold. Those who knew her consistently described genuine warmth, but private, careful about what she showed, and to whom. The women who served her in her more intimate household knew a different version of her than the one the public saw. They traveled with her, sat with her in the evenings, accompanied her on the walks and rides that were her primary form of daily relaxation. They saw her tired, they saw her amused. They saw her respond privately to events that publicly she was required to absorb with equanimity. And they kept those observations in the best tradition of the institution they had inherited, almost entirely to themselves. There is a story from Elizabeth's later years that I keep returning to. After the death of her husband, Prince Philip, in April of 2021, they had been married for 73 years, the longest marriage of any British monarch in history. Elizabeth appeared in public at his funeral service, sitting alone in the chapel at Windsor. The image traveled around the world, a 94-year-old woman in black maintaining composure in public grief, separated from the people she loved by the pandemic restrictions that were still in force at the time. It was a painful image, and it was in its own way perfectly characteristic of a life spent performing composure in public, regardless of the private reality. What the public did not see, what it never sees by the logic of the institution we have been exploring all evening, was what happened before that chapel entrance. Who sat with her in the hours before the service? Who stayed close in the days that followed? The ladies-in-waiting know, and they have not said, that discretion is 500 years old. It runs unbroken from Cat Ashley, sitting with the young Princess Elizabeth, through candle-lit nights in the 1540s, all the way to the women who sat with the last Queen Elizabeth in the 21st century. Same function, different world, same fundamental human need, being met by the same fundamental human offer of quiet, loyal presence. Now, there is one more dimension of the modern story that I want to bring in, because it represents something genuinely new, a chapter in the institution's evolution that the women of the Tudor court could not possibly have imagined. When Princess Diana became part of the British royal family in 1981, marrying Prince Charles, the heir to the throne, she brought with her a group of ladies-in-waiting, who were in some ways unlike anything the institution had previously produced. They were her friends first, people she had chosen herself, based on personal connection, rather than aristocratic lineage or family alliance. That shift from ladies chosen primarily for social standing and family connection to ladies chosen primarily for personal rapport represents, I think, the clearest possible illustration of how completely the institution had evolved from its origins. The political function, the intelligence-gathering function, the elaborate hierarchical signaling function, all of those had fallen away or reduced to vestige. What remained was the thing that had perhaps always been the most human part of it: companionship, trust, the presence of people who knew you before the title and loved you regardless of it. Diana's ladies-in-waiting, particularly her closest friend and lady-in-waiting, Anne Beckwith Smith, who had served her since the very beginning of her public life, provided exactly this. They were present for one of the most public, most scrutinized, most difficult passages through royal life in modern history. They absorbed what they could of the external pressure. They maintained their discretion about what they saw and heard. And after Diana's death in Paris in August of 1997, in the sudden, devastating way that her death came, the women who had served her carried forward exactly what Jane Dormer had carried forward 4 centuries before. Her memory held privately, spoken of carefully, with a loyalty that continued past the point where loyalty was required by any official obligation. So here we are. We've traveled from the 9th century to the 21st, from the Carolingian queens to Elizabeth II, from Han, Japan, to the Ottoman Palace, to the Forbidden City, to Windsor Castle. And what this long, winding, occasionally heartbreaking, frequently astonishing journey has revealed is a thread of women, thousands of them across the centuries, who occupied the space between the official world and the human one, who served and witnessed and understood and kept quiet about what they understood, who built networks and exercised influence and occasionally changed the course of history, and who did all of this without the titles, the monuments, the official recognition that their male counterparts expected as a matter of course. The institution of ladies-in-waiting is often described as an anachronism, a relic, a charming survival from a world that no longer exists. But I am not sure that framing is right. I think what it actually represents is a way of understanding power that is not anachronistic at hand. A recognition that the most consequential relationships are often the ones closest to the enter. That proximity matters. That trust built slowly and maintained carefully is a form of influence that official structures can never quite replicate. Those truths are not historical, they are permanent. And that brings us finally to the last chapter, the one I have been building toward all evening, because we have looked at what these women did, how they learned and influenced and survived, and sometimes did not survive, how they served and were served in return, how the institution evolved across 5 centuries and 5 continents. But there is one question we've not yet fully answered. What did they leave behind? Not the political outcomes, not the dynasties they helped shape, or the policies they helped influence, but the deeper thing, the thing that survives when the politics have dissolved, and the palaces have become tourist attractions, and the names have faded from all but the most specialized, historical memory. What do we carry without knowing we carry it, from the world these women created? That is where we are going next, and it is, I think, the most important stop on this entire journey. There is a particular kind of legacy that history almost never talks about, not the legacy of monuments, not the legacy of legislation or military campaigns, or the kind of achievement that gets its own chapter in a textbook. The legacy I am thinking about is harder to see. It lives in patterns of behavior that we have inherited without knowing we inherited them, in ways of being with other people, ways of listening, of observing, of managing the space between what is felt and what is shown that were refined over centuries in specific environments by specific women, and that somehow filtered forward into the world we actually live in. The ladies-in-waiting left this kind of legacy, and tonight, before we reach the final chapter of this story, I want to try to trace some of those threads. Not the political outcomes, we have talked about those, Not the dynasty shaped or the policies influenced the deeper thing, the thing that outlasted all of it. Let me start with the written word, because one of the most extraordinary legacies of the ladies in waiting tradition is a body of literature that we are still reading, still arguing about, still being moved by centuries after the women who created it are gone. We talked about Murasaki Shikibu in the previous chapter, but she was not alone. Her contemporary at the Han court, a woman named Sei Shaon, was also a court lady, also serving in the imperial household, also using the relative freedom of the vernacular Japanese script to produce something genuinely remarkable. Seogon served the Empress Tatia, a different empress from the one Murasaki served in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The two women were rivals, not personally perhaps, but professionally and aesthetically. They represented different sensibilities, different approaches to the court world they both inhabited. Where Murasaki Shikibu turned her observations of court life into the psychological depth and narrative sweep of the tale of Genji Shaogon, did something entirely different. She wrote lists. That sounds anticlimactic, I know, but hear me out. The Pillow Book C's major work, written around the year 1000, is a collection of observations, anecdotes, meditations, and yes lists that together create something that feels uncannily modern. Lists of things that make the heart beat faster. Lists of things that are awkward. Lists of things that are elegant. List of situations that are embarrassing, or delightful, or unexpectedly moving. She wrote about the specific quality of light in the early morning in a particular room, about the sound of a cart passing in the distance at night, about the precise emotional texture of waiting for someone who does not come. She was doing something that we now take entirely for granted in literature, and frankly on the internet, the personal essay. The observation turned outward. The invitation to recognize yourself in someone else's, specific, honest, slightly self-deprecating account of being human. Seogon invented that mode 1,000 years ago while working as a court lady. And here is what strikes me most deeply about this. Both she and Murasaki Shikibu were writing from within a system that gave them almost no official outlet for their intelligence and capability. They were not permitted to participate in the formal literary culture of their time, which was conducted in classical Chinese and was a male domain. They had the lesser script, the vernacular language, the domestic subject matter. And from those constraints, from the specific angle of vision that their position as ladies-in-waiting afforded them, they created the two foundational texts of Japanese literature, works that have never gone out of print, works that continue to be translated, studied, and loved in dozens of languages across the world. The constraint was the condition of the creation, not despite the limits through them. Now I want to move to a different kind of legacy, one that is less about what the ladies-in-waiting wrote and more about what they modeled. Because there is a set of practices, professional practices, relational practices, that were developed and refined within the ladies-in-waiting tradition over centuries and that have migrated in various forms into the modern world in ways we rarely acknowledge. Think about what a skilled lady-in-waiting had to be able to do. She had to manage a relationship with someone who held enormous power over her life in a way that was simultaneously genuine and calibrated. She had to provide emotional support without losing her own equilibrium. She had to gather and manage sensitive information responsibly. She had to navigate competing loyalties to the queen, to her family, to her own conscience with consistency and grace. She had to present herself in every public setting in a way that reflected well on the person she served, without drawing attention away from them. And she had to do all of this while maintaining over years and sometimes decades a standard of performance that left no room for the kind of open frustration or visible fatigue that might undermine the trust she had built. Does any of that sound familiar to you? Because if you strip away the historical context, the Tudor gowns, the palace corridors, the candle light, what you have left is a remarkably precise description of several modern professional roles. The chief of staff, the personal assistant to a very senior executive, the communications advisor, the trusted confidant of anyone whose public life is permanently observed. The skills that these roles require, the emotional intelligence, the discretion, the ability to be genuinely present for another person's needs while managing your own professional performance. Those skills were being developed, practiced, and passed on within the ladies-in-waiting tradition for 500 years, before anyone gave them a job title or wrote them into a professional development curriculum. I find that genuinely remarkable. Not as a metaphor, as a literal historical lineage. There is another legacy I want to name directly: the legacy of testimony, one of the most underappreciated functions of ladies-in-waiting, one that we have touched on throughout this story, but never quite examined as a category in itself, was their role as witnesses. They were present for events that no official record fully captures. They saw the private faces of public figures. They heard words spoken in moments of unguarded honesty. They watched history being made from the closest possible distance in the moments before the official version of events was decided upon and broadcast to the world. And some of them, enough of them, wrote it down. Not always immediately, not always in forms meant for publication, but in letters, in diaries, in the kinds of private writing that were never intended to become historical documents, and became historical documents anyway. The diary of Marie Mallet, which we mentioned in the previous chapter, is one example. The letters of Liselotte of Bavaria, thousands of which survive, and which historians continue to mine for their extraordinary candor about life at Versailles, are another. The memoirs of Lady Mary Wortley Montague, who moved through the courts of early 18th century Europe with the eyes of both a participant and an outsider, contain passages about the interior life of the court circle she inhabited that official records would never have produced. And going further back, the letters of the Spanish ladies-in-waiting, who accompanied Catherine of Aragon to England, and who wrote home to Spain with accounts of the English court that their employers would certainly not have approved those documents, give us angles on Tudor history that we simply would not have without them. These women were not journalists. They were not historians in any formal sense. They were people living their lives and recording what they saw, sometimes because they needed to process it, sometimes because they wanted to share it with people they loved, sometimes perhaps because some part of them understood that what they were witnessing deserved to be remembered. The result is a body of testimony that is in aggregate one of the richest sources of social and psychological history for the periods they cover. Not the history of what was decided, the history of what it felt like. Here is a question I want to put to you. When you think about the most important knowledge in your own life, the understanding of people, of relationships, of how power actually moves through human systems, where did that knowledge come from? Was it from a book, a course, a lecture, or did it come from watching? From being present in rooms where things were happening and developing over time, an increasingly precise sense of what was real underneath the surface of what was being performed. Most of the deepest human understanding works the second way. It comes from observation, from proximity, from the slow accumulation of noticed details over time. The ladies-in-waiting were professional observers. Observation was not incidental to their role. It was the core competency the role required, and the knowledge that accumulated in those women. The understanding of human behavior under pressure, of the specific ways that power shapes personality, of the gap between public performance and private reality. That knowledge was real. It was sophisticated. It was earned, and it found its way forward into the world in ways that are still being traced. Let me tell you about one particular form that legacy took. In the late 19th century, as the formal institutions of European court life were contracting fewer royal courts, smaller households, a general movement away from the elaborate ceremonial structures of the early modern period, something interesting happened. The skills that had been developed within those institutions did not simply disappear. They migrated into the emerging professional world of social secretaries and personal assistants, into the Nent field of diplomatic protocol, which drew heavily on court traditions for its standards and practices, into the world of charitable and civic organizations, which in the Victorian and Edwardian periods were staffed largely by upper-class women, whose grandmothers might have held positions at court. The women who filled these roles brought with them, often without consciously framing it, this way, a set of practices and understandings that had been developed over generations. How to manage a complex social calendar on behalf of someone else. How to handle sensitive correspondence with discretion and appropriate formality. How to navigate the social landscape of an institution with competing factions and unspoken hierarchies. How to be useful to a person of significant authority without losing your own integrity or your own voice. These are not trivial skills. In the 20th century, they became the foundation of professions that employed millions of women, and the women who practiced those professions often did so with a sophistication and rarited competence that was inherited at several removes from the tradition we'll removes. But exploring all evening, there is a specific figure I want to bring in here, because she represents to me the clearest possible bridge between the historical tradition of the court lady and the modern, professional world. Her name is Alicia Gordon, or more formally, Lady Alicia Gordon, and she served as a woman of the bed chamber to Queen Alexandra, the wife of King Edward III, in the early years of the 20th century. After leaving royal service, Lady Alicia became deeply involved in establishing one of the first formal training programs for what we would now call executive secretaries. She brought to that work an explicitly articulated understanding of the skills she had developed in royal service, the ability to anticipate needs before they were expressed, the capacity to manage sensitive information without allowing it to affect your own presentation or judgment, the discipline of maintaining consistent performance standards regardless of personal circumstances, the social intelligence required to read a room accurately and respond appropriately without explicit instruction. She wrote about these skills not extensively, but clearly enough that historians of women's professional history have cited her work as an early articulation of what would later be codified into formal professional development frameworks. She was describing in the language of the early 20th century a body of knowledge that ladies in waiting had been developing and practicing since the 9th century. I want to turn to something a little different now, because not all of the legacy left by ladies in waiting was practical or professional. Some of it was architectural, literally. The physical spaces that ladies in waiting inhabited, the antechambers, the private parlors, the sitting rooms adjacent to the Queen's bedchamber, shaped the architecture of domestic spaces in ways that filtered into the broader culture over time. The idea of a room specifically designed for intimate conversation, comfortable, private, removed from the formal spaces of public life, developed within the court environment in response to the specific needs of the Queen's household. The boudoir, a word that comes from the French verb bouder, meaning to sulk or to withdraw, was originally a small room in a royal or noble household designated for private retreat. It was the kind of space a queen might use between her official duties, where she could be attended by her ladies without the performance that more formal settings required. That spatial concept, the private withdrawal room, the intimate sitting space, migrated out of royal palaces into the design vocabulary of the aristocratic townhouse, then into the middle-class domestic ideal, and eventually into the modern understanding of what a home should offer. The idea that a house should contain spaces designed specifically for privacy, for intimate conversation, for the kind of interaction that cannot happen comfortably and fully public rooms. That idea has royal antecedents, and the women who demanded and shaped those spaces were in large part the queens and their ladies. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of all, and the one I find most personally moving, is something even harder to see than architecture or professional practice or literary tradition. It is the legacy of a particular way of being with another person. The ladies in waiting at their best practiced something that we do not have a great word for in English. It was not friendship exactly. The power differential was always present. It was not service exactly. The emotional dimension was too real, too mutual in its own way. It was a kind of skilled witnessing, a practice capacity to be fully present for another person's experience, to hold it without flinching, without fixing, without making it about yourself. That is when you encounter it, one of the rarest and most valuable things one human being can offer another. That capacity, developed over centuries in the specific conditions of royal service, did not stay in the palaces. It found its way into the world, into the understanding that the people closest to those who carry public burdens serve a function that is not reducible to their official duties, into the recognition that presents genuine, steady, reliable human presence is a form of support that no policy, no institution, no formal structure can fully replicate into, if I am honest, the way many of us think about what it means to be a good friend. Now, I want to acknowledge something. Throughout this entire story, across 10 chapters, across 5 centuries, across courts, and cultures, and continents, we have been celebrating in various ways the intelligence and capability of the women who occupied this role. And that celebration is earned. The history is real. The accomplishments are genuine. But I also want to be clear about something. The system that produced these accomplishments was not a good system. It was not designed with women's flourishing in mind. It was designed to serve the needs of monarchies and the extraordinary things that the ladies in waiting achieved: the literature, the political influence, the cultivated wisdom they achieved, despite the system, not because of it. The constraints were real, the costs were real. The women who are used up, who are trapped in roles they did not choose, who grew old in service without recognition or adequate compensation, or the ordinary freedoms that their male counterparts took for granted. Those women are part of this story too. The legacy of the ladies in waiting is not only the legacy of what were accomplished, it is also the legacy of what was asked. And what was asked was in many cases too much. The women who navigated that reality with grace and intelligence and humor and sometimes genuine joy. Those women deserve our admiration. But they also deserve our honesty. Admiration without honesty is just another kind of eraser. There is one final thread of this legacy that I want to name before we reach the conclusion. The letters. We keep coming back to them. The letters of Marie Mellet. The letters of Lizo of Bavaria. The letters that Henrietta Maria's ladies wrote from exile. The letters that Spanish ladies in waiting sent home from foreign courts. The letters that were never meant to be read by strangers, and that became, through the accident of survival, some of our most important windows into the past. These letters share something, all of them, regardless of the century they were written in, regardless of the language, regardless of the specific circumstances of the woman who wrote them. They are honest. Not always consciously honest, not always deliberately telling the truth that official accounts obscured, but honest in the way that private writing always tends toward honesty. Because when you are writing to someone you love in a moment of genuine feeling, the performance falls away. The ladies in waiting spent their professional lives performing, maintaining the composure, the discretion, the carefully managed presentation of self that their role required. And then they sat down alone with a candle and a piece of paper, and they wrote what they actually thought. Those letters are the cracks in the performance, the places where the real person shows through. And what shows through in letter after letter, century after century, is something I find genuinely moving. Intelligence, humor, frustration, tenderness, exhaustion, love. The complete, complicated, fully human experience of women who were asked to make themselves small in public, and who in private were anything but. We are almost at the end now. One final chapter remains, and it is in some ways the simplest. After all the history, all the drama, all the politics, all the extraordinary individual stories we have followed, through this long evening, the last chapter asks a question that I think you already know the answer to, even if you have never quite put it into words before. The question is this: what does it really mean, at its most fundamental, to watch carefully, to be present without demanding recognition for that presence, to understand power well enough to move within it without being consumed by it? The ladies in waiting spent centuries answering that question with their lives, and what they found, what I think we've been slowly discovering together all evening, is waiting for us in the final chapter right now. There is an old question that philosophers have debated for centuries. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? I have always thought that question, while philosophically interesting, misses something more important. The question that actually matters is different. It is this: if something extraordinary happens, if a decision is made, a kingdom shaped, a life changed, and the person who made it possible leaves no official record, did it happen? Did it count? The ladies in waiting would have known the answer to that immediately, without hesitation. Of course, it counted. It counted completely. The absence of a record does not diminish the reality of what occurred. It only diminishes our ability to see it. And learning to see it, learning to look in the places that official history overlooked is, I think, one of the most important things this story has been quietly teaching us all evening. We are at the end now. Not just the end of a long night of storytelling, though it has been that. The end of a particular journey through courts and corridors, through centuries of silk and whispered counsel, through the full human spectrum of loyalty, and betrayal and love, and political calculation, and quiet, daily, unsullied devotion. And before I let you go, before I send you off into sleep, which you have earned, and which I hope will be deep and full of something peaceful, I want to gather the threads one final time. Not to summarize. We've been through too much together for a summary to do it justice. But to say what I actually think this history means. Let me take you back to a very specific moment. The year is 1533. The place is Greenwich Palace, just east of London. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had waited and watched and understood from her years as a lady into a waiting exactly how to navigate the most dangerous court in Europe, is being crowned Queen of England. The procession through London is extraordinary. The streets have been decorated. The crowds are dense. The pageantry is total. And riding in that procession, attending the new queen, are the women who have served her, some of whom have known her for years, some of whom were serving Catherine of Aragon 12 months ago, all of whom are watching from their position, just behind the center of everything, with the particular attentiveness of people who have been trained to notice what others miss. None of them know what is coming. They do not know that within 3 years, the woman they attending today will be gone. That the daughter born of this brief reign will become Elizabeth I, arguably the greatest monarch England ever produced. That the history being made in this procession will be argued about and written about and dramatized for the next 500 years. They just know what's in front of them. The crowd, the noise, the extraordinary human moment of a woman who had played the long game, finally arriving at the destination she had aimed for, across a decade of patience and risk. And they are there for it, present, watchful. Part of it in the way that the people who stand just off-center are always part of things essential to the composition, invisible in the official portrait. I have spent a long time with these women, longer than I expected to when I first started pulling on this thread. And what I keep arriving at, what this history keeps insisting on, no matter how many times I approach it from different angles, is something that feels almost too simple to say out loud. The most important things that happen between human beings rarely happen at the center. They happen in the margins, in the in-between spaces, in the quiet moments that precede and follow the official ones, in the conversations that take place after the meeting is over, when the public face has been set aside and the real thinking begins, in the rooms that the portraits never showed, and the history is never quite described. The ladies in waiting knew this. They built their entire existence around it, and in doing so, they demonstrated something about power that every era needs to relearn. Power is not only what it announces itself to be, it is also what it does not announce. The silent kind, the patient kind, the kind that accumulates in the space between what is said and what is understood. Now, I want to ask you something directly, something I have been building toward all evening. Think about your own life, not the official version of it, not the resume or the public persona or the story you tell at dinner parties, the actual lived version. Think about the people who have most shaped who you are, the moments that most changed your direction, the conversations that mattered most. Were those moments at the center of things, in official rooms, at formal occasions, in the situations that were designed to be significant, or were they in the margins, in quiet conversations that no one else heard? in the presence of people who were simply there, reliably and honestly in the moments when you needed someone to be, in the spaces that no portrait would ever show. I ask because I think most of us, if we are honest, will find that the margins are where the important things happened. Not always, not exclusively, but more often than the official version of our lives would suggest. The ladies in waiting understood this not as a consolation, not as a way of making peace with not being at the center, but as a genuine insight about how human life actually works. And that insight, refined over centuries, is part of what they left behind. Let me come to the last figure I want to introduce in this entire story. She's not a famous name. She did not shape empires or write immortal literature or survive dramatic reversals of political fortune. She served as a lady-in-waiting at the court of William and Mary, the joint monarchs of England who came to the throne in 1689 after the Glorious Revolution for approximately 12 years. Her name was Elizabeth Howland. She left behind when she died in the 1720s a small collection of personal papers, letters, a brief memoir, some household accounts that a local historical society preserved, and that a scholar came across in the 1980s. The memoir is not long. It is not elegant by the standards of the period. Elizabeth Howland was not Murasaki Shikibu. She did not have the literary gift or the literary ambition. But there is a passage in it, one paragraph near the end, that I have read many times, and that stays with me in a way that the more dramatic and better documented stories sometimes do not. She is writing about what she misses in her old age, about her years at court. Not the grandeur, not the proximity to power, not the sense of being at the center of things. She writes that what she misses most is the particular quality of attention that the role required. The way what serving someone else, really serving them with genuine care and genuine attentiveness, had taught her to notice the world. She writes that before she came to court, she had moved through her days without looking carefully at anything, that the years of training her observation on another person had unexpectedly sharpened her perception of everything, of light and weather, and the expressions of strangers, and the particular way that a room changes when the people in it are comfortable versus when they are performing. She writes that she came to understand over time that the deepest knowledge is not the knowledge you go looking for. It is the knowledge that accumulates in the act of being present, of paying attention, of caring enough about another human being to actually see them. I do not think Elizabeth Howland intended to write something profound. I think she was simply being honest about her own experience. But that paragraph is to me the truest summary of everything the ladies-in-waiting tradition produced. Not the political influence, not the literary achievement, not the survival strategies, or the intelligence networks, or the dynasties shaped in candle-lit chambers, the education in attention, the slow accumulating transformative practice of being genuinely present for another person's life. Here is what I believe, and I want to be clear that this is my view, not a historical fact, not a scholarly consensus, just the conclusion I keep arriving at after spending this much time in this particular corner of the past. The ladies-in-waiting were not unfortunate women doing the best they could within constraints they could not escape. Some of them were that sometimes, but that is not the whole story. Many of them, the ones whose lives we can see clearly enough to judge, found something real in the role they occupied, not despite its limitations, but in genuine relationship with those limitations. The constraint of invisibility taught them to watch. The constraint of silence taught them to listen. The constraint of service taught them to attend to something beyond themselves. And in attending to something beyond themselves, in placing another person's needs, another person's reality at the center of their daily perception, they developed capacities that most of us spend our whole lives trying to cultivate and never quite reaching. Empathy, not the sentimental kind, the precise kind, the kind that comes from years of genuine, disciplined, selfless attention to the inner life of another human being. The institution of ladies-in-waiting, in its formal historical sense, is essentially over. When Queen Camilla, consort of King Charles III, announced in 2022 that she would be replacing the traditional ladies-in-waiting, with an informal group she called Queen's Companions. It was understood as a modernization, a sensible update to an institution that had been evolving for over 1,000 years and had now reached its final form. The Queen's Companions do not hold official titles. They are not organized according to noble hierarchy. They are simply friends, women who have known Camilla for years, who will accompany her at public events and provide the personal support that the role is always required. And in that simplification, in that stripping away of all the formal apparatus to reveal the human core underneath the institution, arrived finally at its own essence. It was always about this, about the presence of trusted, intelligent, devoted women beside the women who carried the weight of public life. Everything else, the hierarchy, the titles, the political maneuvering, the elaborate systems of access and precedence, was the context, the history, the accumulated layers of centuries of adaptation. But underneath all of it, the thing itself was always simpler: showing up, staying, paying attention. I want to close with something that I think is worth carrying with you into sleep tonight. Every single woman we have talked about this evening, from Kat Ashley reading bedtime stories, to a 4-year-old princess who had become Elizabeth I, to Murasaki Shikibu writing the world's first novel in stolen moments, between her duties to Mary Seton, dressing her queen's hair in a prison tower 40 years after they grew up together at the French court, to Marie Mallet, writing letters to her husband about the extraordinary, ordinary reality of serving Queen Victoria. Every single one of them was doing something that required an act of sustained, deliberate, daily choice. Not the dramatic choice, not the moment of crisis choice that history tends to focus on. The daily choice, the choice to be present, the choice to pay attention, the choice to place another person's reality at the center of your perception, and to let that placement slowly, patiently, irreversibly teach you something about what it means to be human. That choice is available to all of us right now, in whatever version of proximity and service and attention our own lives offer. We do not need a court. We do not need a throne room, or a bedchamber, or a gilded corridor, or a queen. We need the same things those women needed: the willingness to notice, the patience to wait, the courage to stay when staying is difficult, the understanding that being present for another person, really present with genuine care and genuine attention, is never small. It is never small, no matter how invisible it appears from the outside, no matter how completely it fails to show up in the official record. It is the work that holds everything together. It always has been. And so we reach the end of this particular journey. 12 chapters, 12 windows, into a world that has been hiding in plain sight for centuries. 12 conversations with the women who stood just off-center and saw everything. I have loved spending this time with you, genuinely. There is something about the specific quality of attention that a story like this requires. The willingness to slow down, to sit with complexity, to let history teach you something about your own life that I find every time quietly extraordinary. If any part of tonight's story moved you, if any one of these women stayed with you in a way that surprised you, I would genuinely love to know. Leave a comment below. Tell me which woman you are still thinking about. Tell me which moment landed differently than you expected. Tell me if you fell asleep somewhere around chapter 7 and had to come back. I would not blame you in the slightest. That was practically the point. And if this was the kind of night you want more of, if this particular corner of history, the hidden corners, the margins, where the real stories lived, if that is the kind of company you want to keep as you fall asleep, then please subscribe. Not because numbers matter, but because every person who subscribes is a signal that this kind of storytelling is worth continuing. And I very much want to continue it. There are so many more rooms to walk into, so many more women waiting in the margins to be seen. The next story is already taking shape, and I genuinely think, it is going to be one of the most remarkable things we have explored yet. The world is full of quiet power. We have only just started learning to look for it. Sleep well, dream of candle-lit corridors and women who understood everything, and I will see you in the next one.